Hello and welcome to the Australian Roundtable podcast. Today is Sunday the 8th of February 2015. This is episode 18 of our weekly broadcast live at youtube.com/Australian Roundtable from 3 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time every Sunday, and also archived at the same channel for later listening. I'm your host Johnno, and I'm joined in the studio by my guest Zac. Good to have you here.
Hi guys, thanks to be here.
And I'm joined via Google Hangout by the person who's usually with me here in the studio, and that's Ethan Nash of TOTT News. Ethan, thanks for joining us.
Afternoon, everyone.
And finally, we're joined in Google Hangout again by our resident wise old elder, the silver fox himself, Lindsay. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Now, the show continues to grow, and we're up to over 900 subscribers. So for any new listeners, I'll read out this little blurb that we like to start the show with, so bear with me. The Australian Roundtable podcast is a Brisbane-based independent news analysis discussion panel podcast which broadcasts live every Sunday from 3 p.m. AEST. Live listeners can also take part in a live chat forum at the YouTube channel during broadcasts, and once again, there's already a huge audience in the live chat. The show features an eclectic panel of presenters who come together each week to discuss recent and topical news and current affairs from Australia and around the world, and provides an alternative perspective to that presented by the mainstream media. Views presented by individual panelists and guests are not necessarily representative of the entire panel, and each presenter is solely responsible for his or her own comments and claims. All important information cited during the broadcast will be linked to at our site ausroundtable.com, so you can verify and analyse it for yourself, which I for one recommend you do. Episodes generally run to 90 minutes, sometimes to 2 hours, depends, and although it is a roundtable discussion, we do keep to a rough structure for each episode, generally breaking the show up into a domestic and an international segment. I'll get to today's rundown right now. First off, we'll start off by taking a quick look at the shenanigans concerning our current Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and then we'll get straight into our domestic segment. First up, I'll give some updates on Tasmania and their laws to do with protesting, and then Victoria and their laws or their issues at the moment to do with their east-west link. On our second segment, we'll look at climate change in the Courier Mail. The third segment will be looking at eugenics in Australia. This is a feature piece from Ethan, which I find I'm looking forward to. And then finally, I've got some information about the Royal Commission into institutional responses to sex abuse, and that will also be a feature piece. Then we'll move on to the international segment, where we'll start off by looking at Google and chip implants. Then we'll take a look at finance and some recent happenings in the money markets. And then finally, we'll take a look at the TransAsia air crash during the week and some of the goings on in the skeptic community following that. So that's the rundown for today. But before we get into any of that, we were in a bit of a rush today to do with some technical difficulties. So let's just start off with a general chat and see how everyone's going. Lindsay, how have you been, my good man?
Yeah, I've been very good, thanks. I was just saying earlier on, when we first started out, I was thinking there would never be enough news to fill an hour and a half to 2 hours, but it's just been flat out all week, hasn't it?
It certainly has, and apparently very flat out for a good friend of mine, Ethan Nash of TOTT News. Ethan, how are you today, my good man?
Getting there. Obviously, just had a pretty big week and wasn't able to get up to the studio today, but still here and still looking forward to a good show. So I'm excited. There's a lot of good topics to talk about today.
Fantastic. And since we last had you on the show, Zac, the show has actually grown quite considerably. It's been about 3 or 4 weeks. Do you want to give us an update on how you've been travelling up here in hot and sunny Brisbane?
Yeah, it certainly is hot and sunny today. I haven't really been doing much in the terms of getting up to date on world affairs, so I'd love to be here today and listen to what you guys have to say.
Fantastic. All right, well, with all that said, it is time to get into the news, and the first piece is discussing Tony Abbott, our current Prime Minister. Now, the basic background to this for any international listeners is that for years and years while he was in opposition, Tony Abbott campaigned on many things, including the fact that our government at the time, the Labor government, were a schmozzle. They ousted their leader as a party, then they ousted the new leader for the old leader again, and the whole thing was hectic. It took up all the news cycles, and one of the reasons why that government was voted out was because, hey, you know, who are we voting for? You keep changing your leader. It's all a big joke. And one of his big campaign pitches was elect an adult government, no more children running parliament. Well, the latest news, guys, I'm sure you've heard, is that there's going to be a leadership spill tomorrow probably, and there's a very good chance that Tony Abbott's going to get turfed out, 18 months after being elected. I'll throw to you first, Lindsay.
Yeah. No, I find the whole thing fascinating. I'm not quite sure whether he deserves to be turfed out or not. We'll wait and see what happens, because I really don't like the alternatives either. You've got the Goldman Sachs man in Australia, and that as the alternative, and that worries me too. You know, because who's then running the country? Is it Goldman Sachs or, you know? I do get concerned about just where we're going with all this. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, mate. The background there for any international listeners is that the man who many think will replace Abbott as the leader of the government, and a man who formerly was the leader of them when they were the opposition, is a guy called Malcolm Turnbull, who of course worked, as you mentioned, for Goldman Sachs. Was it Goldman Sachs? It was one of those kinds of firms, and is a multi-millionaire. So I guess what you're getting at there, Lindsay, is that if they do replace Abbott with old mate Malcolm Turnbull, who's really running the country? That's a good question. I'll throw that one over to you there, Ethan.
I think it's interesting. I don't see that he'll be kicked out. Personally, I don't think that the next puppet that the establishment has chosen is ready. I could be wrong about that. I think it's just another thing to sensationalize and just distract us from something else that's happening. A lot of secret negotiations heading overseas, so it's just another distraction in my opinion. But if he does get kicked out, then that does say a lot about the establishment. We spoke off air beforehand, Johnno, about how we mentioned during the G20 broadcast that if he doesn't support the climate change agenda that the establishment is pushing, he might be facing a leadership spill, and that's exactly what's happening. So it could go either way, in my opinion. What do you think about it?
Well, you make a good point. Back when we were covering the G20, so this was about mid-November, we had the three specials, the Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, because of course G20 was here in Brisbane, and we noticed that the one newspaper in Brisbane, which is of course owned by Uncle Rupert, had completely turned against Tony Abbott, as had all the other mastheads across our capital cities who are owned by Rupert Murdoch. They were all suddenly running front page articles or front page captions that were anti-Tony Abbott, and in particular anti his stance about climate change. Of course, Tony Abbott, one of his big messages to get elected was that he was going to axe the climate change tax. In Australia, we actually did have a tax on carbon emissions. As ridiculous as that sounds, we did. So he got in partly on campaigning to get rid of that tax because he is either a climate change skeptic, or use whatever term you like. That's what he is. That's what he presents himself as. And of course, when Barack Obama was in town, what was one of the main things he was talking about? Well, it was climate change and a global effort. And we don't have to go too far down the rabbit hole to say this is all just part of global governance. What's the easiest way to slide in global governance? Well, you need someone to globally govern if we're all taxing carbon or trading carbon or what have you. And this fits perfectly well in with old mate Malcolm Turnbull, because who are the people that serve to get the most money if you're trading carbon permits? Well, it's the people who trade the carbon, isn't it? So any companies who are involved in that kind of securities trading or that kind of equities trading, they're going to be the ones who make a lot of money. Zach, what say you?
Well, I don't know if you know, but he has a personal wealth of $133 million, and he's the richest person in Parliament at the moment.
For all the listeners, Zach's got his little computer up in front of him.
Isn't that an interesting little
It is interesting. So what we've got is a situation where a Prime Minister who was largely installed thanks to a Rupert Murdoch campaign to get him in, well, Rupert Murdoch's newspapers were signalling 3 months ago that they now want him to change his stance on climate change. Now it's time for the fix to come in, and now we all believe in climate change. We all need to take action upon it. Tony Abbott's not going to change his mind on that, so what happens to him? Well, before you know it, it looks like he's going to be turfed out halfway through his first term. I'll throw it back to you, Lindsay.
Yeah. No, I agree with you there. And when we come back to the Goldman Sachs thing, it reminded me of an article by Tabibi, or whatever his name was, who did a whole series on Goldman Sachs, and exactly that, how they were going to make an absolute fortune from trading carbon credits. And it just reminded me of that when you said it. Back to you.
Yeah, and that's what I think is what's going on here. Abbott's job was now to start pushing the same kind of climate change nonsense that Barack Obama was pushing while he was here. He wasn't interested in doing it. Of course, he tried to take climate change off the agenda for the G20 talks. The newspapers started editorializing against him. That should have been his message. He didn't heed the warning, and it looks quite possible that by the end of the week he'll be gone, even if the spill goes in his favor and there's either no spill or they have the spill but he gets re-elected. It doesn't really matter, as we've seen so many times. Once a Prime Minister has a leadership spill against him, it's only a matter of time until the second one gets him. We saw that with Gillard, we saw that with Rudd, and we're going to see that again with Tony Abbott. I think we even saw that with John Howard back when he was the deputy leader under was it Andrew Peacock? Lindsay, your memory's probably better than mine, but
yeah.
time and again, you have your first crack, it doesn't work, you have your second crack, you get rid of them. So it looks like Tony Abbott's gone, and we called that first here on the Australian Roundtable podcast back in November. So there you go, guys. We're taking care of you. Now it is time to move into the domestic segment proper, and we're going to discuss climate change in the Courier Mail. I'll change up the order today just a little bit. We'll throw straight to you, Lindsay. I know you saw something in the Courier Mail you want to discuss today.
Yes, indeed. On Friday, the 6th of February, the Courier Mail carried a story by Brian Williams, and called "Data Shows Sea Could Rise by 9 meters." And I thought, good on you, Brian. I love the way you use the word "could," and that's what they always do with this climate change stuff. And I'll give you a quick quote. He said, "Forget sea rises of 1 meter. A team of scientists, now we don't know who they are, says rises could be more like 9 meters. The last time sea levels were at that height was in the Pliocene era about 3 million years ago." Now, how they know that, I don't know. The Earth was then, the Earth was then 2.5 to 3 degrees warmer, which is about the temperature forecast to occur through global warming. The scary bit is that Pliocene sea levels stood at least 9 meters higher than today. Now, Brian, if there is a lie, why not make it really big? Why stop at 9 meters? Why not make it 90 or 900? You know, it's just talking dribble. You know, and I did a bit of research this, and I'd love to quote Paul Joseph Goebbels. He says the principle, and which is quite true in itself, and that in the big lie there is always a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses of the nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily, or as you and I would paraphrase that, the bigger the lie, the more it will be believed. And apparently it could take 2,000 to 3,000 years to clean up carbon emitted by humans already. And it's also worrying that ice sheets, major contributors to the oceans rising, were slow to respond to global warming. They are like a freight train, slow to get going, but then they build momentum quickly. They also are slow to stop. And I love this metaphor of the coal or diesel burning train when you're talking about carbon pollution. And what happened, and this is my question to him, is what happened to the Arctic ice sheets that were nearly completely gone a few years ago? And there's still no measurable rise in sea levels. Oh, that's right. You mentioned that they were slow to build momentum. I forgot about that. So after the snow melted, it takes a long time to be absorbed into the ocean. Anyway, I'm being cynical, but it just amused me. I find that I really have to read the Courier Mail to get a laugh each week. I'll leave it at that.
Lindsay, have you been drinking too much of your chamomile tea again, mate? You've got the giggles on today.
Yeah, no, it just amused hell out of me when I read it. I thought, I can't believe that they keep getting away with this garbage. They don't ever actually say anything. They say could or would or maybe. They quote scientists, and probably wouldn't quote men in white coats or something. The whole thing, it was going on the ABC the other night as well. They were coming out with the same rubbish there. I just get sick of it. Once you see through it, you realise what a load of garbage it is. And it just amuses me that they keep going on thinking they're going to turn us around. Oh, well, they maybe are turning some people around, but anybody who's got a brain doesn't seem to fall for it. Okay, back to you.
Ethan, you want to respond to any of that?
It's just unbelievable. It just seems like the Courier Mail, they don't even need to even try to do anything anymore. You know what I mean? They don't even try. I bet that article had no hyperlinks in it. The sensationalist garbage that Lindsay just read out from the article is just unbelievable. We've spoke about climate change, and we're eventually going to do an episode focusing on climate change one of these days. But we spoke briefly on it during the G20 conference, and all of this it's too hard to measure all of these things to make a proper exact analysis. And for those using statistics about 3 million years ago, how is that even credible journalism? How can you pass something off like this and expect it to be, even semi-legitimate in the eyes of anybody? It's unbelievable, Johnno.
And as I demonstrated in my video, Sunlies Sneak Preview, they will lie to you about what they said in the same news bulletin 10 minutes ago, but we trust these jokers to tell us about what was happening millions of years ago. It's ridiculous. You know, I tell you what, we keep saying that we're going to eventually do a whole episode on climate change and what I call the global warming myth. We're not going to go through that today because we've got too much information to go through, but since we brought this topic up, I thought I'd go back to my notes that I had prepared all of those episodes ago for episode 11, which of course we were going to do on climate change, but then the Sydney siege crept up and took over. But here's a quick little thing, just following on from what you were saying there, Lindsay. This is from Emeritus Professor Cliff Ollier of the University of Western Australia. Okay, he's a geologist and a geomorphologist and the author of 10 books and over 300 scientific papers, and he's worked in many universities including ANU and Oxford, and has lectured at over 100 different universities. This is an article that he wrote for Online Opinion entitled Tuvalu, the Touchstone Global Warming and Rising Sea Level, November 26, 2010. Now, the article provides a graph which clearly shows that sea levels have been constant over decades, and I'll quote what he says below that. Quote, as you can see, apart from a low in the early records, which seem to be associated with a tropical cyclone, there seems to be no great change in sea level since the early 1990s. Does this show the island is rising? Just look at the inaccuracy. The common sense interpretation of the sea level graphs is surely that Tuvalu and other Pacific islands are not sinking over the time span concerned. The sea level is virtually constant. This destroys the argument that the islands are drowning, end quote. So that's an emeritus professor of the University of Western Australia saying that A, sea levels haven't risen since the early 1990s, and B, countries like Tuvalu that we're always told are drowning, and there's going to be these drowning refugees, he's saying they're not sinking at all. Far from it. Zac, what say you? Oh, well, Zac's too busy typing away on his computer there. Just try to avoid typing on the computer while we're live on the air, Zac. I'll throw over to you there, Ethan. Any comments on that? Sounds like Ethan's also busy with something. Mate. We'll go to you. Lindsay.
Yeah, okay. I'll come back. I remember talking about this subject quite a long time ago, and there was a place in Tasmania where somebody had chiseled a mark on the rocks back in the 1800s, and it still hasn't changed. The sea level still hasn't changed from that. So it's not just from the 1990s, it goes back to the 1800s. It puts a lie to all this rubbish. You get all these clowns on television making all these claims, but you just need very simple facts like that. No, it hasn't risen, therefore there's a good chance it's not going to rise. Yeah, all right,
Absolutely.
Back to you.
Absolutely. So I tell you what, if you're happy, Lindsay, we'll wrap that particular segment up and move on to the next one, which is a feature piece from Ethan regarding eugenics. Ethan, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, John. And sorry for not replying before. My computer's running a bit slower than I thought to get to the unmute button here.
Just one of those days, isn't it, mate?
It's a struggle, but we've got a good feature piece that I've prepared, and it's more relevant than ever at the moment, and it's to do with eugenics in Australia. Now, a lot of people don't understand that as the eugenics movement was taking off during the early 20th century over in the United States, it also was taking off over here in Australia as well, and it wasn't just to do with Indigenous people. A lot of people, when you talk about eugenics in Australia, they think of Indigenous people, about the stolen generation, breeding, interbred breeding to try and breed the black out of them, as they used to say back in the day. But it goes a lot longer than that. And I'll just read something that I've prepared. Eugenics, obviously, for those who don't know, is the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable, heritable characteristics. And this can obviously be done through a lot of ways. And one of the main ones is through sterilization, and it was a very real concept during the late 19th and 20th centuries, especially here in Australia. Now, it obviously started historically by Sir Francis Galton in 1883 over in the United States, but at the start of the 20th century over here in Australia, the first person that comes to mind when discussing eugenics is a professor by the name of Richard Berry. Now, he was a professor of anatomy at Melbourne University from 1903 to 1929, and his work was based around measuring people's heads in pursuit of a theory that a small head indicated that a person had low intelligence. Berry favoured the establishment of a, quote, lethal chamber to euthanize what he called, quote, the grosser types of our mental defectives. He began working frantically with others to bring the ideas of eugenics to the public eye and started gaining momentum amongst various government agencies and committees as a result. This significant push would lead to an attempt to legalise eugenics in the form of 3 mental deficiency bills that were presented to Parliament in 1926, 1929 and 1939 by Premier Stanley, can't pronounce his last name, but I'll leave a link at AusRoundtable.com so you can see those bills that were presented to Parliament. But the Premier that introduced them was a man who had close relations to Berry. The bills would target slum dwellers, homosexuals, prostitutes, alcoholics, as well as those with small heads and low IQs, in an attempt to institutionalize and potentially sterilize people who fell under these categories. The Indigenous population was also seen to fall within this group. The first 2 attempts at the bill failed, not thanks to any significant opposition, rather the political atmosphere in Australia at the time. The third bill was passed unanimously in 1939, but thankfully not enacted in the first instance, which would be obviously due to the change of perceptions about eugenics after the perceived history of World War II and Hitler and all of the so-called ideals that Hitler had affected the eugenics movement because people resonated that with it, whether it's true or not. So eugenics in Australia continued during the 1920s as royal commissions gave birth to a range of eugenic reforms, including measures relating to to segregating child, marriage laws, pensions, and a national survey of mental deficiency that was introduced by a federal minister for health. This was all put to a stop during the Great Depression, and I'll leave links to photos of the Eugenics Education Society in New South Wales and all of their work. It goes on a lot further than this. This is just a paraphrasing sort of approach look at it. It would go to the Great Depression as Australia didn't have the money to fund such programs. But yet again, it wouldn't stop the movement, as eugenics was introduced into Victorian high schools by the first Director of Education, Frank Tate. Tate was a close friend of Berry and strongly supported his research on on the head size research, and on occasions introduced his public lectures. The development would lead to substantial momentum as the director of the Australian Council for Education Research, Kenneth Cunningham, and one of the most significant early psychologists, Chris McRae, began publishing research claiming to show that the working class children were unfit for academic secondary education. As Richard Berry returned to England in 1920, others took up the reins of the movement, founding the Eugenics Society of Victoria. Its members were comprised of some of Melbourne's most influential people, including the Chief Executive Officer of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, the President of the Royal College of Physicians, and the Chief Staff of the Supreme Court of Victoria. Now, this continued to operate till about 1961 before it so-called faded out as ideas of equality began to rise around the world. Now, the main point I wanted to get in terms of this is, one, how do we know that it did fade out? How do we not know that ideals don't continue today? And two, look at the people that were involved in this. These were academics, these were scholars, these were politicians, these were people in the medical establishment that had these ideas here in Australia. And if it wasn't for the wars, if it wasn't for all of these external circumstances, it could have taken over this country and spread past Victoria. And that's a very scary thing, and we need to be aware of our past, and we need to question whether these activities go on today, and question the sick powers that are in our parliament at the moment, and whether or not they're conjuring new things as eugenics takes a more 21st century approach. Johnno.
Well, I want to throw straight over to Lindsay on that one. Lindsay, you've been around a lot longer than I have, and you've seen a lot more than I have. Do you want to give us your background idea on this topic of eugenics and everything that Ethan's touched on today?
Yeah, I was just very interested to hear what Ethan had to say then. I had no idea it was that widespread in Australia. But we only have to look at the way politicians treat us. It's obvious that we are second-class citizens And I don't see, it's only a very small step for them to think, well, you know, we'll get the worst of this. What's the word in muggles or whatever they used to call them in Harry Potter? You know, the morons. We'll get the worst of the morons and just weed them out. And I can see that a very arrogant person, and most of our politicians are quite arrogant, would be quite au fait with that. Okay, back over to you.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Ethan, so you've read out your information. I thought that was a terrific feature piece. What about more generally just your opinion on the topic of eugenics, without getting into a big ethical or moral debate? More broadly speaking, do you think there's any merit whatsoever to the idea of it?
See, it's a tough one. You can see the perspective that those people have, but I don't agree with it because the sick people that conjure up the ideals of eugenics, although they may believe they're helping the human race in the long run, are actually, you know, they don't have any empathy. I don't believe they have any empathy even encoded in their DNA for some people to think of that, because if they were in that person's position, they'd resist it as well. They would say what most people say and what I agree with, and that's that all human beings, whether they have mental deficiencies, whether they have whatever's wrong with them, whether they have crooked teeth, enlarged heads, whatever, all human beings have a right to live and prosper on the planet, and I don't think that a group of small people should have the right to do that. And even if this is the argument I say to people, I say even if they made perfect human beings, whether it's straight teeth, whether it's all these ideals that they had to sterilize the population for people that to create a post-human civilization, I don't think that would work either, because I think we've become such a multicultural society that it's bound to end up like that because of the environment around us. It's never going to stop, no matter how much you want to breed out of people. It's going to continue because races are going to be a thing of the past soon. The white man is becoming extinct. The multiculturalism is expanding all over the world, and it's having an effect on us. And I don't think that it'll work, is my opinion, to say that. I don't think that even if these sick people had a real moral reason to do it, which I don't believe, even if they could do it, which they're trying to do on a daily basis with vaccines and with all of these cancerous foods that we have, I don't think it'll work, Johnno.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess I look at this from another perspective, and some of the information that you've provided, I can't wait to go and double check that for myself and look further into it. I guess when I'm looking at what the powers that be are doing to us as a group of people, I almost look at it from the other perspective too. I think they are trying to dumb us down and to make us more degenerate. And you look around at people today, the few skills that they have, the little understanding they have of who they are, the spirituality, how humans relate to the environment, what have you. You look at what takes up the attention spans of most so-called adults today, whether it's sports for men or movies for men and women or fashion for women. You look at the fact that most adults today in the Western world, so-called adults in the Western world, could tell you who's married to Kanye West, but couldn't tell you a single thing about the draconian anti-terror laws that were supposed anti-terror laws that were passed last year. I think we're at a state now where, if not necessarily physically, then certainly psychologically and mentally, it's hard to imagine that humans have ever been more degenerate than they are today. I'll throw to you, Lindsay.
Yeah, okay. I equate this, I've had the conversations about genetically modified foods with people who are so arrogant that they think that whatever they do, it will be perfect. They don't seem to be able to get the message through the head that they are only human and they can make a stuff up and that could destroy the world virtually, could wipe out a whole species of plants or whatever. And I think it's the same when we come to this. You're dealing with very, very arrogant group of people, a class or whatever they are, who think that they could manipulate human beings to make a better group of human beings, whereas what they don't understand is the interplay between all these things. You know, what genetic qualities that may make somebody appear like a lunatic, when you have the first cross or whatever, you get hybrid vigor. So they haven't got the ability to do it, but they're arrogant enough to think that they have got the ability. And I think that's what we're dealing with. We discuss this all the time about the arrogant, the elite and their attitude to us. And I think this is just another another path that they've gone down.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely. And justiceforgermans.com, and I love his username in the live chat, says that there's no need for population control because Western worlds have declining birth rates. And of course, that is correct. It's interesting, isn't it, when you look at it, when they domesticate animals or they put them into zoos, they can't get them to breed, okay? Whether it's panda bears or rhinoceros or whatever, once you put them in a zoo, they stop breeding. Isn't it funny how when a Western country starts developing or a third world begins developing, that their birth rates start declining as well? Do you think that's a coincidence? Zac, you've been quiet. I'll throw that over to you.
No, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's a typical characteristic of people or animals that are in cages. People who are in cages don't want to procreate. They don't want to reproduce. They want to die because they're not happy. They're not in their natural environment.
I'll tell you who's also not in his natural environment is old Zac over here. We're upstairs in the studio, and he is struggling with the heat, mate. If you need to go and grab yourself some water or something, feel free to excuse yourself. I'll throw it back over to you, Ethan. I know that you're interested in this topic. Do you want to tell us where you think that the powers that be, whoever they are trying to take this longer term, and how far you think they'll get?
Eugenics, to me, it is a major part of the New World Order plan. Obviously, eugenics, but it's tough to predict where it's going to go. Really, they're obviously trying more so, and that's why I said at the end of the article is they want to tell us that eugenics faded out at the end of the 21st century. No, it didn't fade out, it just became modernized. It just became accepted in a subliminal way with the food that we have, with the fluoride in the water, with the vaccines, all of these things that affect the human race. Do you see the Queen with eating McDonald's? Do you see the Queen with all of this stuff? Do you see the powers that be not with their organic farms like they have, not with their proper food? It's still eugenics. It's still targeted amongst us, and it's only going to accentuate because one of the main things I believe would happen if let's say a global riot broke out, if the economy collapsed, everyone went into panic and chaos, one of the plans that they do have for the final eugenics plan would be to release a bioplague while they go into their underground bunkers up in Switzerland or wherever they are. Anything that targets people thinking that you know better and you can control a bunch of mass of the people and say what's better for free humanity, that's eugenics. And I think it's continuing on, and it's going to continue on because it's a major part of the New World Order plan, and it's something we need to expose. And that's why I wanted to make this feature piece to tell people that these ideals have been going on for a long time, not just internationally, but here in Australia as well, Johnno.
Yeah, and can I just interject a little bit there? We've got a lot of new listeners in the live chat. I want to read out some greetings. We've got the Jasut Order Rules today, says greetings from Mexico. MS Watchman for You says greetings from Milwaukee. I think that's in Wisconsin. And Eco Divers Phuket, Thailand says, g'day from Thailand, guys. I want you all to know that we are still checking the live chat, but we've got a lot going on today. Firstly, unfortunately, Ethan wasn't able to make it into the studio. Secondly, Zac has made it to the studio, but he's a guest. He's still learning the ropes with the technology, and he looks like he's stuffed. He had to trek all of about 2 kilometers to get to my house, and I think that's just about ruined him. So listeners, please bear with us. And that's without even touching on the fact that obviously, as we go to air right now, there's another show that deals with somewhat similar topics to what we do. And at the moment, it looks like there's a big kerfuffle taking place in the event skeptic community, which we will touch on later in the show if we get the time. But listeners, please keep your questions coming in the live chat box and keep the chat going. It's good to see you all there. Now, Ethan, before we do move on to another topic, do you have any final thoughts you want to say about the topic of eugenics?
No, I wrote an article similar to this at tottnews.com, which is my website, Australian Alternative Media, quite some time ago, and it's still one of the most consistently viewed articles on the website. So if you do want to find an archive of all this information, obviously I'll provide links in the description at ausroundtable.com once the official upload is there. But if you want to see that and share it with your friends or just introduce yourself to the topic of eugenics, there'll be tons of information at ausroundtable.com to introduce yourself to it, because it's vitally important that eugenics becomes widespread in terms of knowledge and awareness of it to fight this war against the New World Order. So that's my final thoughts. Just do the research, be aware, and share it around for others to become informed.
Fantastic. And Lindsay, like I said, you've been around a lot longer than us, and you've seen, I would argue, society degenerate further and further in your time. Do you have any more final thoughts on this broader topic of society, eugenics, degeneracy, what have you, before we move on?
No, I haven't. I'm going to go and do a bit more research myself after this. So, no, I haven't got anything to add now.
No problemo. Well, it's time to move on then to the final piece in our domestic segment today, and that is, of course, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse, which is a segment that I've put together. So this piece is a lengthy one wherein I'll be quoting large passages from a number of articles, and it involves a number of fundamentally important issues facing Australia today. So it deserves the time that I'm going to give it. And it'll probably take about 20 or 25 minutes. So I thank the listeners in advance for their patience. Now, here's the background. A Royal Commission in Australia is a major formal public inquiry, often headed by retired judges. And in 2012, the then Gillard government announced a royal inquiry into child sex abuse at institutions, such as religious organisations, following revelations of widespread cover-ups in the Catholic Church. Momentum for such an inquiry had been growing in strength for decades, and in the months leading up to the announcement of the inquiry, even Catholic bishops had begun to publicly support the campaign for a Royal Commission. The inquiry began on January 13 and is ongoing. Recently, it has for the first time looked into such incidents at Jewish institutions. This article is entitled Child Abuse Royal Commission. Sydney Rabbi did not know it was a crime for an adult to touch a child's genitals. February 6, 2015. This is from the ABC. Quote, a former director of an Orthodox Jewish school says he did not know it was a crime for an adult to touch a child's genitals. The Royal Commission into Child Abuse has heard. Rabbi Yosef Feldman was questioned about the way he dealt with abuse claims against a rabbinical student known as AVL at the Yeshiva Gedola in Sydney in 2002. Counsel assisting the commission, Maria Garachi, asked, did you understand that it was against the law for an adult to touch the genitals of another child? I didn't know that as a fact, Rabbi Feldman answered. The commission heard AVL admitted lying down and massaging the child. The rabbi said he didn't have a clue that could be a criminal matter. My role in general is to look at things from a Jewish perspective, from a religious perspective, Rabbi Feldman said. I'm not in the business of thinking about how society would deal with issues. AVL left the country less than 48 hours after a complaint was made against him in 2002. Rabbi Feldman is the former president of the Rabbinical Council of New South Wales and the son of Rabbi Pinchas Feldman, who is the head of Sydney's ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. He said he was not familiar with child abuse laws, despite the fact he was the director of the school for about a decade. Obviously, I would have certain obligations. I didn't really know what they were, Rabbi Feldman said. I relied on my father. At the time, I must be honest with you that I may not have been aware. End quote. Now, what that article doesn't state is the following. Now, this is from the Sydney Morning Herald. Royal Commission, Rabbi let man flee because he did not know about sex abuse allegations. February 5, 2015. Quote, within 2 days of the complaint, AVL had left the country. Before leaving, AVL told Rabbi Feldman and his father he intended to return to America. They did not prevent him from doing so and did not inform police when he left. End quote. Now, one more article before I give a quick recap. This is from the Herald Sun down in Melbourne. Article entitled Jewish Leader Put Girl 12 into Sex Offender Daniel Heyman's Care, Royal Commission Hears. This is from February 5, 2015. So this is all from the previous week. Quote, a senior Jewish leader placed a 12-year-old girl in the care of a now convicted sex offender despite being told he had abused a string of boys, the Royal Commission has heard. The young girl said while she was staying with Daniel Gug Heyman, he indecently assaulted her and would often walk around totally naked. She was put in his care after being sent to Sydney to study from interstate by her parents. Gug would walk out of the bedroom completely naked. I would be sitting on the couch doing my homework and I would be completely shocked. I had never seen a male naked before, she said. For years, rumours about Heyman had circulated and a string of boys say they complained to senior Chabad leader Rabbi Borak Lashiz. He denies any complaints being made to him despite Heyman, who was last year convicted of abusing a 14-year-old boy, telling police Rabbi Lashiz had pulled him aside and told him to stop. When the 12-year-old girl later complained that she had also been abused, Rabbi Lashiz allegedly said she was imagining it or had dreamt it. It is not known if Lashiz, who now lives in New York, will be called to give evidence during the 2-week hearing probing Melbourne and Bondi yeshiva centres. It is believed the commission, who won't comment on the matter, are negotiating with him to attend. His former boss, Rabbi Pinchas Feldman, Sydney's top rabbi since 1968, yesterday said Rabbi Lashiz had no obligation to pass on complaints of abuse to him. Rabbi Feldman said he had always made it clear that complaints of abuse should be passed to police. But when in 2012 he was, 2002, he was told of a complaint, he admitted allowing the alleged offender, a man studying to become a rabbi, to flee overseas just 24 hours later. We are not in a position to hold him back, he said. I did not believe, and I do not believe at the moment, that within the framework of my role, I should have to call the police to say this student may leave. I did not notify police that he said he may be going. If that was an error of judgment, I apologize. End quote. Now, there was a lot of information in what I just read out, and I encourage listeners to check out the links provided at ausroundtable.com for themselves. But here is a basic recap of the main details. Joseph Feldman, who is about 45 years old, is the son of Pincus Feldman, and I'll refer to them as Joseph and Pincus from this point forth. Joseph Feldman, 45 roughly, Pincus Feldman about 70. Joseph is the son of Pincus. Now, Pincus is to this day the head of the Orthodox Jewish community in Sydney, while Joseph was previously the president of the Rabbinical Council of New South Wales. And for our international listeners, bear in mind that New South Wales is our largest state, and its capital, Sydney, is our largest city. Now, Joseph was the director of an Orthodox Jewish school in Sydney. In 2002, a student at the school complained that an adult member of the school, known as AVL, had sexually abused them. AVL told Joseph and his father, Pincus, that he was fleeing the country immediately after complaints were made against him. Neither of them attempted to stop him or to notify the police, and both admit to all of this. Now, in the past week at the Royal Commission, Joseph has claimed that although he had been director of a school for a decade, he didn't know it was a crime for adults to touch the genitals of children, or what his obligations were in situations where such allegations were made against members of his school. He relied on his father in these matters, and since his father didn't tell him what he needed to do, he simply didn't know. Now, I'll repeat a quote from Pincus from one of the articles I just read. I did not believe, and I do not believe at the moment, that within the framework of my role, I should have to call the police to say this student may leave the country. I did not notify police that he said he may be going. If that was an error of judgment, I apologize. If that was an error of judgment, that the head of the rabbinical community of the city knew that a member of a school at which his own son was a director had been accused of sexually abusing a child and was planning to flee the country, did not notify police, if that was an error of judgment. Now, I want the listener to put aside religion for a moment and imagine that this is your child making a complaint of sexual abuse against a member of the school. Any school, doesn't matter what religion or if it's religious at all. Imagine that the director of the school and his father, who happens to be head of the community, are aware of the allegations and have been told personally by the accused that they plan to flee the country within 48 hours of the complaints being made. Imagine that neither of them even notify the police. And imagine that at a royal commission over a decade later, the son, who was the director of the school, claims he didn't know it was a crime for adults to touch the genitals of your child, and that he didn't notify the police because his father didn't tell him to do so because he relied on his father for such information. Imagine that the father, the head of the community, would sit at the same royal commission and say that he did not and does not believe he should have to notify the police in such a situation, and that if it was an error of judgment, I apologize. Imagine that. Now imagine that in the same year as this happened, 2002, the same head of the community was awarded the Order of Australia. I'm not making this up. This is from the 2002 Queen's Birthday Honours List. Quote, Rabbi Pincus Feldman, Bondi, New South Wales, for service to the Jewish community of New South Wales, particularly through the development of spiritual, educational, and welfare facilities. End quote. That is the explanation for why he received the Order of Australia Medal, OAM. To this day, Pincus Feldman is an OAM. So not only is Pincus the head of Sydney's Orthodox Jewish community, but he was even awarded one of the country's highest honours by our then Prime Minister, John Howard. And if you check his Wikipedia page, you can even see a grinning Howard shaking hands with Pincus while holding a menorah, the menorah being the Jewish candle with 9 stalks coming off it or whatever. Now at this point, I want to break up me talking for so long. I want to break up the monotony a little bit. I've got a bit more to go here, but before I go any further, I'll throw to you, Lindsay. Based on what you've just heard, what are your thoughts?
I've read an article through the week, and I haven't got it at hand, but basically, the article I read suggested that it is part of the community's belief system that they do not. It's almost like police not ratting on their mates. the Jewish community, particularly those members of the Jewish community, do not go to outside authorities. They try and deal with everything in-house. That's the
Lindsay,
first thing.
you're 100% spot on, and that's where the second half of my segment is going to go. So I'll cut you off there. Sorry to do that to you. Ethan, have you got any thoughts on what you've just heard?
No, mate. No. I think it just all ties together again. Like it just seems like it's a big topic, and it's hard for me to express the thoughts that I want to express at this time. So
well, I'll tell you who can
express
their thoughts, and I'll tell you who can express their thoughts, and that's some of our listeners in the live chat. I'll read out a couple of quotes from people while I was talking there. On the one hand, we have Robert Alexander, who says that if it was his child, the rabbi wouldn't be worrying about the police. And Rorschach says that Johnno, Western Australia is our largest state. I should be more clear. WA is the largest by landmass, you're quite right, but in terms of our largest state by population, New South Wales is, of course, our biggest state. That's what I meant to say, but thanks for pulling me up. I should be more clear there. New South Wales is the largest state by population, Sydney the largest city by population, and again, the two people we're talking about, the two Feldmans, the father and the son, they are the head of a number of bodies to do with rabbinical councils and these kinds of things. So what I'm saying is this is a large scandal involving an important community in our largest city and state. That's a point I was trying to make. Now, I will go on with the article that I've put together here. And my next question was to ask that, or to point out that listeners might have heard what I just said and be wondering, how is it possible that the head of one of these communities, just I'll tell you what, bear with me because I've lost my notes here. I'm going to throw to you, Zac. Based on what you just heard, what do you have to say?
Well, it's kind of more of a general religious thing to me. Like, I think religion in general sexually oppresses people, and then that kind of inadvertently comes out in a lot of religions of being pure and the guilt and everything associated with sexual oppression. So of course it's not surprising to me to hear that story of a couple of rabbis or priests or whatever touching a child. It's not anything new.
Okay, well, I've refound my notes. Apologies to the listeners for that. Well, I'll get on with the rest of this article. Now, based on all what I've just read out, the listener might be wondering, what could possess a man of the highest standing within his own community, responsible for the well-being of children within his community, to allow an alleged sex offender against one of his own community to flee the country within hours of a complaint being lodged against him? I'll move on to the next article. This is from the Australian on February 5 of this year. Jewish belief sees claims a child abuse ignored, says leading rabbi. Quote, a prominent ultra-Orthodox rabbi has warned that key Jewish concepts are being misused to prevent reports of child sexual abuse, amid claims that leaders within the Chabad community are still failing to confront cases they have known about for years. Rabbi Moshe Gutnick yesterday told the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse that the historical code against Mazira, I'm going to pronounce that Mazira actually, against Mazira, informing on a Jew to non-Jewish authorities, should never apply to criminal cases, but had been misused by those in power. He described how a Jewish doctor who discovered injuries on an infant consistent with sexual abuse was threatened with Mazira after reporting it to police and child protection services. This was only a few years ago with an infant, said Rabbi Gutnick, a former president of the Organization of Rabbis of Australasia. It is my belief that the threat of transgressing Mazira is used as a means with which to retain power and control. I believe it is an absolute religious obligation to report any allegation of child sexual abuse as quickly as possible to the appropriate authorities. To suggest that there is some religious obligation not to do so is an abomination. The Royal Commission is currently examining the response of the Orthodox Chabad Yeshiva Centre and School in Melbourne, as well as its counterpart in Sydney, after the abuse committed by 3 convicted pedophiles became known amid accusations of widespread cover-ups. A man known by the pseudonym AVB, who was abused at Yeshiva College in Bondi and by a Yeshiva Melbourne staff member, told the Commission he had been ostracised after emailing community members in 2011 about the need to cooperate with authorities. He attached a Victoria Police request for assistance to the email, as well as a statement from the Rabbinical Council of Victoria saying Mazira did not apply to sexual abuse and there was a religious obligation to report such abuse to the authorities. AVB told the Commission that he later saw Rabbi Meir Shlomo Klugan, the current president of the Organization of Rabbis of Australasia, who told him he should not have sent the email. AVB said current Chabad leaders had long known about the abuse and failed the victims. From the time the Victoria Police investigation started in 2011 until today, They label the victim as some kind of devil and say they should burn. He said former executive of Australian Jury President Danny Lamb had described to him the police investigation of former yeshiva teacher David Kramer in 2011 as the tip of the iceberg, end quote. Now, had anybody here, this is I mean, obviously you had, Lindsay, but Ethan or Zac, had either of you heard of this concept of Mizrahi before today?
I had not heard of it,
No.
but what?
So neither of you had heard of it. Lindsay, would I be right inferring that you've probably heard of this concept of Mizrahi before?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I remember reading about it back in Germany before the Second World War. There were instances of it there, and I suspect that it's gone way back, nearly 2,000 years. That this is for a group living amongst other people, they've had to do this. It's this sort of the mentality of the group as opposed to the broader community you live in. And I think you'll find that it's not just them, but I think they take it to extremes. Now, can I make one other point?
Please do.
Yeah, that I've got Judaism discovered here, and one of the points of that is that the rabbis, when they circumcise a boy, probably a baby, I'd say, they use their mouth to do it. So straight away, to me, that's a really strange thing. It's almost like fellatio during the circumcision. That to me is really very odd. But I mean, I haven't experienced it firsthand. I'm only going on what these books are saying. And also, if you throw back then to the Talmud, there are things in the Talmud about raping young girls, and if they're under a certain age, their hymen will grow back, and this sort of thing. There's some really weird beliefs within these groups.
Well, I'll tell you what, Lindsay, you know my style. I like to, if we're going to say that a book says this or that someone says that, to be able to have the quote ready. So what we might do is in a future episode talk about some of the religious texts, not just in Judaism, but in Islam and Christianity, and do some kind of critical analysis. I'd love to do that. I know you're very well versed in all of this. I'm going to press on with this article, and the reason why I asked you these questions about have you guys heard of Mizrahi is because, and this shows my naivety here, prior to this week, I'd never heard of it. It makes intuitive sense to me that a community would have their own little closed system. That makes sense. But I'd never heard of Mizrahi or this notion that Jews in Australia were using this to avoid going to the police over these kinds of matters. So I did some research, and I'm going to share that with you guys and the listeners right now. This is from The Guardian, an article entitled "Rabbi was allowed to keep teaching after admitting abuse of children," inquiry told, from the 3rd of February of this year. Quote, "A rabbi who admitted to sexually abusing children at the Orthodox Jewish Yeshiva Centre in Melbourne was allowed to keep teaching because senior religious leaders feared he would self-harm if they fired him. Giving evidence to the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse on Tuesday, Zephaniah Wax spoke of how 3 of his children were abused by staff at the centre and of a culture that discouraged him from going to the police. In 1993, one of Wax's sons told him that his younger brother was being abused by a teacher, Rabbi David Kramer, at the Yeshiva College. Wax said he went to the school principal, Rabbi Abraham Glick, who told him he would speak to Kramer. A few hours later, Glick called Wax and said Kramer had partially admitted to what he had done, but that the children had initiated and enjoyed it. Wax said he was shocked when he noticed Kramer was still teaching at the Yeshiva Centre school a couple of days later. I confronted Glick and said, "How is this possible? What is going on?" Wax told the commission at Melbourne's County Court. Glick said a psychiatrist concluded Kramer allowed himself to be caught because he wanted to be stopped and there was a danger of self-harm, so we cannot fire him. I thought this was absolutely outrageous. However, if I reported this to the police, I would be in breach of the Jewish principle of Mizrahi. Wax said the concept of Mizrahi prevented members of the ultra-Orthodox Chabad sect of Judaism from going to outside authorities. At the very least, the breach of Mizrahi almost certainly always leads to shunning and intimidation within the Jewish community, and would almost certainly damage marriage prospects of your children, Wax told the commission. Despite this all-encompassing culture that frowned upon members from going to police, Wax said he arranged a meeting with other parents from the Yeshiva College to discuss what to do about Kramer. He wanted to get them to agree to collectively approach senior leaders at the centre and tell them if they did not fire Kramer, they would all go to the police. That meeting was called off, Wax said, when he received a call from Harry Cooper, a senior lawyer and chairman of the management board of the Yeshiva Centre, who told him they would fire Kramer. In fact, the centre paid for Kramer to go to Israel, where he attempted to get a job as a teacher, Wax told the commission. Wax said he believed Kramer abused about 60 children while teaching in Melbourne. Later, Wax said he found out another of his sons, Manny, had also been abused, but by 2 other senior yeshiva staff. By this point, he believes going to police was a no-brainer, he told the commission. The taboo had been broken, he said. Manny Wax gave evidence of the abuse he suffered on Monday, telling the commission how he was bullied and ostracized by the yeshiva community when he came forward. Both Manny and Zephaniah Wax have left Australia since speaking out about the abuse, the commission heard, because of intimidation and isolation they experienced from yeshiva community members. The commission is examining child sex abuse in the Jewish community for the first time since hearings began in early 2013, end quote. So, here we have yet another case of allegations of sexual abuse being swept under the rug, and yet another case of the perpetrators being given free passage to flee the country, in this case having their costs paid to fly to Israel, and most interestingly, an explanation of how Mazira works. If you speak out about the crimes of a fellow Jew, you risk being shunned by your community to the point of having to leave the country. And now I want to read out an article which explains the process by which Jews apparently force one another to stay silent and keep the dealing of crimes between themselves. This is from the Sydney Morning Herald, article entitled Jewish Sex Abuse Victims Pressured Not to Assist Police, Secret Tapes and Emails Reveal. And this is from January 28 of this year. Quote, members of Australia's Orthodox Jewish community who assist police investigating alleged child sexual abuse have been pressured to stay silent, secret tape recordings and emails obtained by Fairfax Media reveal. The details of the pressure being exerted on victims have emerged as the Royal Commission into Child Sex Abuse prepares to hold public hearings next week to examine the responses of Melbourne and Sydney's yeshiva centres to alleged offences dating back to the 1980s. In one secret, legally recorded 2011 telephone conversation, prominent Melbourne criminal lawyer Alex Leuenberg tells a victim of St Kilda Yeshiva Centre sex offender David Cyprus he should not have cooperated with the police. I am not exactly delighted that another Yid, Jew, would assist police against an accused no matter whatever he is accused of, and that is the reason why I was very disappointed, Mr. Leuenberg, who was defending Cyprus at the time of the conversation, told the victim, because there is a tradition, if not a religious requirement, that you do not assist against Abraham, and I was concerned about that. Moser principle. Mosiris is well known. Mr. Leuenberg was referring to the Jewish tradition of Mazira, under which a Jew does not inform secular authorities about another Jew. Members of ultra-Orthodox communities who assist police are often ostracized and given the derogatory label of Moser or informer. Fairfax Media has also obtained a series of emails which show how 3 influential members of St Kilda's yeshiva community asserted that the victim's assistance to police in the Cyprus case had crossed red lines and had the potential to undermine the yeshiva centre. They warned that if the victim continued to stick his nose where it doesn't belong, a new article about the victim would be posted on an anonymous blog. In comments posted online in 2013, the same victim was described by yeshiva members as a sick man and a coward who should be thrown out of the community. The victim's employer was also contacted by prominent members of Melbourne's Orthodox Jewish community and told about the assistance he had given police. End quote. Now, of all the articles that I've cited today, this is the one that you need to read for yourself because there is some incredible stuff in there. I've only read out a portion of it, and as always, links will be provided on our website, AusRoundtable.com. But here's a doozy from the same article. Quote, in Sydney, a former prominent member of Bondi's Yeshiva Centre, Daniel Heyman, last year pleaded guilty to indecent assault of a minor and received a 19-month suspended sentence. A bizarre legal oddity allowed him to escape conviction for the alleged assault of a 12-year-old girl, end quote. Now compare that to the case of Brendan O'Connell, as we discussed 2 weeks ago on episode 16 of the Australian Roundtable podcast. If you didn't catch that episode, I do recommend you go back and check it out. It's easily one of our best episodes of all time. For fans of Jeff C., he was our guest that day, which made the episode even better. Anyway, long story short, an Australian man named Brendan O'Connell was imprisoned for 3 years. While at a small anti-Israeli protest in Perth, O'Connell's photo was taken by unidentified Jewish men. O'Connell and the Jewish men got into a debate about Israel's atrocities in Palestine, and O'Connell said that he thinks Judaism is a religion of racism and murder, or words to that effect. He was imprisoned for 3 years for saying that. Prominent member of yeshiva community admits to indecently assaulting a minor and receives a 19-month suspended sentence, no criminal conviction. But if you make supposedly anti-Semitic remarks to a random person who takes your photo for no apparent reason, 3 years in jail. Offensive comments about one particular religion, 3 years behind bars. Indecently touch a child at a school of that same religion, no conviction, no jail. Think about that. Now, recapping the main points of the 6 articles I've cited today. The top leaders of the Sydney and New South Wales Orthodox Jewish communities not only conspired to allow an alleged sex offender to flee the country, they feign ignorance about their legal responsibilities regarding duty of care and even outright admit that they do not feel obliged to notify police in such situations. The top leader, Pincus, was awarded an OAM in the same year he kept silent about alleged sex offender fleeing the country. In one case before the Royal Commission, a known sex offender was flown to Israel to teach when the father of the victim was told the offender would be fired from the school. People who have been offended against are pressured overtly and covertly to keep quiet and not inform police by Jews adhering to the notion of Mazara. Mazara is basically the principle that it is wrong to inform non-Jews of the transgressions of fellow Jews, and this is a doctrine apparently adhered to by Orthodox Jews around the world. And even when a Jewish man admitted guilt in indecently assaulting a 12-year-old child, he was let off by a New South Wales court without conviction or jail time for his actions, while an Australian man in Perth who dared to criticise Judaism spent 3 years behind bars for his words. Now, I strongly urge all listeners, especially those in Australia, to read the articles for themselves and come to their own conclusions about what is going on in this country at the moment. Our site is usually updated within 24 hours of the podcast, and every article I cited will be linked to in an easy and simple to use format. Now, I thank the listeners for their patience in what I just read out. I'm going to throw straight to you, Ethan, and then we'll get Lindsay's thoughts. Ethan, what say you?
Ethan just said a minute ago that he had to duck off, so he's not there at the moment.
Well, then we'll go straight to you, my good man. What are your thoughts, Lindsay?
Yeah, I'm in two minds about all this. It's, you know, my views on the way the Jewish behaviour in Australia is, how I think they've compromised almost every level of our society, and I've said this openly. But it's not just, I had a whole article I had here out of the Courier Mail about metadata, and they were claiming, oh, we need your metadata, which is our privacy, so that we can bring child porn rings to task. And it just goes on this same vein. It's there has been too many instances where particularly lawyers turn a blind eye. It's not just Jewish lawyers. Lawyers in general turn a blind eye to child pornography. I'm not sure what it is. I think you might have a number of different groups working together. I'm just horrified by the whole thing, and I don't know where we start. When I was listening to you, I thought maybe this is an opportunity for the non-Jewish community in Australia to reach out and look after these people who are ostracised, because that may help drive a wedge into this nonsense. I'm not sure what the answer is.
Sorry, mate, that was the point I was making there, was the victims that we're talking about here were little Jewish children. Do you know what I mean? So this isn't a matter of attacking Jews or Judaism. This is a matter of saying that there are little Jewish children in this country who are being abused, and even when their parents speak out against it, firstly, the parents are ostracized from their community, and secondly, the people responsible with a duty of care for these children are covering the whole thing up because of this Mazara concept that they have to keep everything within their community. So I'm sure that if people heard what I just said out of context, it'd be easy to take certain parts of what I just said and somehow accuse me of being anti this or anti that or whatever. That's all a load of nonsense. We're talking about little Jewish kids in this country who are being abused by people in the duty of care, and then those communities covering it all up. I mean, this is sick stuff, Lindsay.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely. And when you're talking about a bloke called Kramer, I remember some time ago reading about a Kramer who left the country under a cloud, and who later got caught for interfering with children in America. And I'm pretty certain that the North Americans did jail him. So with a bit, there's some justice in the world. But yeah, no, we've got to do something about this, but I'm not sure what we do, because we get back to this same thing. We've got a criminal system or a so-called justice system which is corrupt as blazes. I can refer. I might do it now if you don't mind. I won't take very long. But there was an article by Pickering, the cartoonist Larry Pickering. He's got a website. And there's an article in there, and I'll refer to that on the website, on our website. But he talks about the Chief Justice, or well, he's now actually the governor of Queensland. He was the Chief Justice, and accuses him of pedophilia. So, you know, where do you stop? And I've been waiting for Larry Pickering, the cartoonist, to be sued, and he's never been sued. And so I think, well, you know, maybe there's something to this, that they can't sue him because he must have some evidence somewhere. You know, so how do you get justice for anybody in a system where the judges or the lawyers in general are involved in this whole damn system? Okay, I'll throw back to you.
These are good questions, Lindsay. And while we were chatting in the live chat box, some people were making some comments. Firstly, Rorschach says circumcision by the mouth, WTF. And yeah, until relatively recently in my life, I had no idea that that was part of the practice. But yeah, apparently for certain sects within Orthodox Judaism, this is the go. This is how it's done. And yeah, look into it if you dare. And Tim Osmond says it's Zionist Jews, not Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews oppose Zionism. Tim, I'd love to know what your sources are for that, my friend, because let me tell you, I don't have any of my papers in front of me here, but the same person I was talking about, that Feldman character, the 70-year-old Order of Australia medal winner, who said that he knew that the guy was going to flee, but it wasn't his job to notify the police. That same person was in a court case with another Jew in Melbourne about a decade ago, I think. In fact, just after all of this happened, I think it was 2003, a guy called Joe Gutnick, who any of our Melbourne listeners will know, was the president of the Melbourne Football Club down there back in the 90s and possibly the early 2000s. Anyway, long story short, Feldman's yeshiva centers, or some sort of body related to that, owed Gutnick millions of dollars. Gutnick took him to court and wanted the money back because it hadn't been paid back for years. So what Feldman did was appeal to one of the rabbinical courts in Israel, where apparently they have this doctrine where you're supposed to settle these kinds of scores in a Jewish or a Talmudic or a rabbinical. I have to confess, I'm not completely au fait with the entire Judaistic religion. I'm still learning about all this, but some kind of Jewish court system instead of going to secular courts. And what happened was, because the New South Wales court had found in favour of Gutnick, he was owed millions of dollars, he expected the money to be paid. So Feldman appealed to this Jewish court and said, I want to have it heard in Israel, and if Gutnick won't agree to it, you should excommunicate him. So all of those kinds of pressures that we talked about, the way they try and shut up parents of abused kids, they'll even do it to other multimillionaires. And Feldman is a classic example. So if you're trying to tell me that Feldman, an Orthodox Jew, isn't a Zionist, explain to me how come, instead of accepting a decision by the New South Wales court that he had to pay another Australian money, that he decided instead, I'm pretty sure Gutnick is Australian, he's Jewish anyway, but he was in Australia. Instead of paying him money, he was going to appeal to an Israeli court, a Jewish Israeli court, so that the matter could be heard there instead of having to accept the New South Wales court's decision. Explain to me how that isn't consistent with being a Zionist. Please, Tim, I think you need to look into this further. Lindsay, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. There's not much more I have to say about it. I remember Gutnick from a long time ago, and he had a whole lot of mining leases in Western Australia, if I remember rightly. But he was also donating money to Israel. So yeah, that's my background on him. But there's not much we can add to this. I mean, we've pretty much said it. I think for me, I'd have to go and do some research. Maybe we can do it next week or in weeks to come, where I've actually got all the quotes out of the religious books, and then there's no argument with it then.
Okay, I've got some more comments from the live chat. Benny B says Australian Roundtable 100% respect. Sorry, I'll repeat that. Benny B says Australian Roundtable 100% respect. Thanks from Canada. No worries, Benny B. This is what we do every Sunday from 3 p.m. So please join us every Sunday. G. Hardy Smith says, glad I held back my comment. Well, look, I do appreciate in our live chat, it would be easy for people to go over the top of their comments. We don't want anyone saying anything that might get anybody in trouble. I'm certainly not saying anything that I think will get me in trouble. So with your comments, feel free to speak freely. Just don't go around trying to offend people. Certainly with this show, Zac, I'm not interested in trying to offend people. All I'm talking about here is the truth, which leads me to a comment from Mr. 797 in the live chat, who says that if it wasn't for the Royal Commission, we wouldn't even be allowed to talk about this because of the Royal Commission. Now this is all on public record, and I think that's a very important point to make. I had no idea about any of this. You know what I mean? I grew up in a world where we're told that the extremist Muslims are out to get us, and that they think if they go to if they kill people, they'll go to heaven where they'll get 70 virgins or some nonsense. We're raising kids to believe that because that's what the TV's saying. But what is the TV saying about Messiah or about certain Orthodox Jewish doctrines, Zac? Nothing. What say you?
Exactly. They say nothing, so you have no idea what they think. I mean, it's a media blackout, isn't it? And they certainly don't say anything negative about Israel ever, which is kind of unbalanced. If there's a conflict, you'd think you'd hear both sides of a story, And you always hear the negative thing about the Palestinians, but you never hear the negative things about Israel.
Yeah, and Porky Minch in the live chat says, forget Jews, we have bigger enemies to deal with. I agree with that. The point that we're making here, Porky, is that our justice system is utterly corrupt, and we have here in this country a group of people, regardless of what their race, colour or creed is, who work together to the point of even having their own children when they're abused. They'd rather have that child go without justice than go to our justice system, because that's the doctrine of their books. Now, that in and of itself should be a problem. What should be a bigger problem is how few people know about this. Even myself, I consider myself somewhat educated and somewhat learned. I had no idea about any of this until just this week because of the research I was doing. I like to read the mainstream media now just to keep tabs of what's happening. I saw an article, followed it, went down the rabbit hole, and here I am telling you right now, look at this. I had no idea of this until a week ago, which raises another question. Why do we know all these terrible things about the Catholics? Why do we know all of these terrible things about the Muslims? But the average person today, like Rorschach, listening to the show right now, had no idea of even a basic practice within Orthodox Judaism. Why is that? That's a question you should be asking. It's a question I'm asking. And Lindsay, I'm sure it's a question that once upon a time you asked as well.
Yeah, I many times, and the same thing. You go down dry gullies until you get to some. Well, basically, when I started going back to the original books, I remember when I was living in northern New South Wales, I actually got a copy of the Talmud, one book of the Talmud up, so that I could actually go in and check to see what the books that I'd been reading and were quoting from the Talmud were actually saying. But it wore me down, because they'd start arguing over whether you could eat an egg that was laid by a chook if it had laid it before the sun went down on a Friday, and it just went into this sort of nonsense. And I thought, man, this is just, it's not learned to me. That's just garbage. But the point I'm coming back is, you've really got to go back to the original books, and then when you say something, you know your own mind. Yes, I've seen that in their books, and I think that's what we have to do.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And somebody in the live chat said that, I think it might have been one of the people I quoted before, said his comment about the Jews wasn't to do with Jews generally, just about the Holocaust. We haven't even talked about the Holocaust at all today. If people are listening to us for the first time, you can go back to last week's episode and the one before, where we touched on the fact that people who have discussed the Holocaust have ended up in jail in this country. And I don't think any of us on the show have expressed opinions one way or the other about the official narrative of the Holocaust. Maybe that's a topic we can get into at a future time. But this show, I mean, I'm sure a lot of our critics, if they exist out there, they could easily come out, quote a passage from me or from Lindsay out of context and suggest that we are anti this or racist that or whatever. But this is not about that at all. We're talking about little kids, whether they're Jewish or otherwise, being abused, and when their parents try to do something about it, their parents being shunned from their community instead of justice being done. And what we're talking about, Lindsay, I'm sure you'll agree, is that we live in a country that likes to think that it has a justice system that works for all. Clearly, we have evidence here that there are people who aren't just subverting it, but are intentionally subverting it as part of a culture that they base on a book that was written God knows how long ago. And this is an important thing that I think Australia should be talking about. And because it's not discussed in our mainstream media, certainly not on our televisions or our radio programs, that it's up to the alternative media to talk about it. That's what we are with the show, the alternative media, and that's why we talk about these things. But I can guarantee that if we discovered a similar thing happening in the Catholic Church or the Christian Church that wasn't being talked about by the media, we'd spend the whole show talking about that, wouldn't we, Lindsay?
Yes, indeed we would. I agree with you entirely. You can be criticised if you say this, and that was that. I think you quoted it a few weeks ago about you can tell who's in charge of the country by who you can't talk about, and that's where we're trying to break that mould.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, that's a quote that's misattributed to Voltaire. I think a lot of people say, to know who rules over you, find out those who you can't criticize, and they quote they claim that Voltaire said that. I've looked into that quote, and I understand that that's misattributed to Voltaire, but it doesn't matter who said it. I think it's just a truism. It's completely true. If there's someone that you can't criticize, maybe they have too much power. And we live in a country right now where somebody can abuse a little child, a little Jewish child, at their Jewish school and get away with it. No conviction, no jail time. But a man who criticizes the same religion spends 3 years in prison. If you don't think that there's something utterly sick about this scenario, then I think there's something sick with you, and maybe TV's to blame. But I tell you what, if you guys are happy with this topic, I'm happy to move on. We'll get into the international segment now, and Lindsay, I know you've got something to say about Google and chip implants.
Yes, indeed, I do. I'm just madly trying to find what... Yeah, here we are. I've got my papers. I've got so many pages today that I'm having difficulty finding things. Okay, I'll give you a quote first of all. Is Google planning a microchip for people's brains? Engineering boss at the internet giant says sci-fi style technology will begin by helping disabled people control wheelchairs. And further to the quote, but Google is staking its future on a new service which will use the information it holds on registered users to automatically predict their search needs and present them with the data they want. The ultimate ambition is to literally get inside users' heads using search, just remember that quote, using search queries to read their thoughts and then fulfilling their data needs by sending results directly to microchips implanted into people's brains. Now, that was from the Daily Mail on the 22nd of July 2013, which was some time ago. But what brought it to mind was just this week, it suddenly becomes relevant following a meeting in Switzerland at Davos, when the chief executive of Google, Eric Schmidt, spoke during a session on the future of the digital economy. At the World Economics Forum, this is a quote now, at the World Economics Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Google guru Eric Schmidt gave an answer regarding the evolution of the web. I will answer very simply that the internet will disappear, Schmidt said on Thursday. There will be so many IP addresses, so many devices, sensors, things that you are wearing, things that you are interacting with, that you won't even sense it. It will be part of your presence all the time, he explained. Imagine you walk into a room and the room is dynamic. And with your permission and all of that, which he glosses over very quickly, you are interacting with the things going on in the room. A highly personalized, highly interactive, and very, very interesting world emerges, Schmidt concluded. And I've got the links to that, which we'll put in the website. The point I've tried to make of this is that so many people have been freaking out for so long, the idea of we're going to have chips implanted in us. And here they're not even trying to hide it. They're saying this is a really good thing. We're going to put chips in your brain so that when you think of something, we'll be able to give you the answer without you using your equipment. Now that scares hell out of me. If they can go into your brain, what else are they going to pull out? And what else can they put into your brain so that you'll become nice and docile and do exactly what they want? That just the fact that they're actually talking openly about this at this meeting scares hell out of me. But then when I had a look and saw that Soros and a whole lot of other people that go to the Bilderberger meetings were also at this meeting, that didn't surprise me. Okay, over to you.
That's fine. Ethan, you've been away for a little moment. Did you catch most of Lindsay's intro just there?
Yeah, I did, and it's unbelievable how the normalization of human microchipping, not just the surveillance state. We spoke last week about devices in cars, about smartphones, about the surveillance state in general, but now going to where it goes into your body with human microchips it's unbelievable. And I remember even 3-4 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, the notion of human microchipping would be demonized. You'd be called a conspiracy theorist. You would become, a recluse from people if you preach this notion that microchipping is going to come one day. And now they're just normalizing it. And I found an old article while you were reading that, Lindsay, on tottnews.com that I found from the Sydney Morning Herald, and it's entitled "Human Microchipping. I've Got You Under My Skin." And this pretty much sums up how they're normalizing human microchipping within the body of people. It says thousands of technology enthusiasts use it as the ultimate app, enabling them to lock and unlock their homes, cars, computers, and mobile phones with a simple wave of a hand. But there's a catch. They must have a microchip inserted into their bodies. The idea may seem weird and painful, but human microchipping appears to appeal not only to amateurs who call themselves biohackers, but also to governments, police forces, medical authorities, and security companies. It involves a hypodermic needle to inject RFID microchips the size of a grain of rice, usually into the person's hand or wrist. The same kind of chip is used for tracking lost pets. The implant sends a unique ID number that can be used to activate devices such as phones and locks, and can link to databases containing limitless information, including personal details such as names, addresses, and health records. And then it goes on to just for a mountain to tell you how good microchipping is and how good RFID tags have benefited society as a thing. And it says the virus was replicated on the swipe cards of the staff accessing his building. They're talking about how this was used, the notion that maybe a human could become infected with a computer virus if they had this in their arm. And it said the virus was replicated on swipe cards of staff accessing his building and infected the university's database. Nonetheless, Gasson and other scientists say a new world with mass populations of computerized people is imminent and inevitable. And I just read this article from the Sydney Morning Herald and said, you can't, this is absolutely unbelievable. This is madness. How can you think that this is good on any remote level? There's no justification to see why this is good on the surface for any person with a semi-functioning brain, Johnno.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. I mentioned last week on the show how Jeff C of Free Radio Revolution about 8 or 9 days ago did a video talking about how implants, subdermal implants in your hand, these aren't a matter of science fiction. These are here, and they're being implanted in people as we speak. And the interesting thing about the article that he spoke about in that video was that people were almost having to volunteer to do it. They weren't doing it by going door to door. They were doing it by going into companies and getting the companies to want to offer it to their employees. So instead of swiping in with a swipe card, you swipe in with the little chip that's in between your thumb and your forefinger. And that's the interesting thing that I took away from all of that. A lot of people imagine this, terrible future where they'll go door to door and start chipping people and taking away those who refuse to chip. No, it's going to be a lot more insidious than that. They'll get people to want the implants. And I don't know if you guys have ever walked past an Apple store when a new iPhone is being released, but I happened to be in Queen Street Mall in Brisbane one day a few months ago. It must have been when the latest iPhone was released. And you never see queues of people because the Queen Street Mall is more of a thoroughfare than it is a queuing area. But I saw all these people queuing up, and I thought, what on earth are they queuing for? And sure enough, what were they queuing? They were queuing up for some phone store to get their latest iPhone. And you look at how many sheep love Apple. This is just one example. I'm not having to go at Apple or any particular company. The point is, people who are so happy with a new iPhone, they really think that this new technology is going to make their life better. You look at how many people dedicate their lives to posting on forums about new technology and updating their phones or all this kind of nonsense. Just wait until you give them the chance to have an implant in their hand and tell them it's by Apple, and just wait until they start jumping over themselves to get a chance to do it. Zach, what say you?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be out of force. It's going to be out of consent. I think people are going to willingly take these things on, whether it's through the idea about security or about being the next level of technology or being through convenience. People will be naive to the more sinister undertones of what the motives are behind the reasoning for it, but I think it will be very soon, if not now, in the next few years. And it'll start in a fairly innocent way, I think, and then it'll become more sinister.
Lindsay, I'll throw back to you, mate.
Yeah, I've got 2 points to make. Some years ago now, people were getting very worried in Queensland because they were taking blood samples from newly born babies, and they were worried about the DNA, keeping a DNA record and what have you without the parents' consent. But then other people started saying, yeah, well, when they put the hypodermic in there, how do you know they're not pumping a chip into the baby as well as taking blood out afterwards? So, you've got to be a little bit careful. Some people can go a bit over the top, but then again, with these people's track record, they may well be doing those things. The second point is, I know a woman who's had a number of dogs that have been chipped, and those dogs develop cancers and things like that around the chips. So I would be very concerned if I was a person having something like that put inside me, because I just don't trust them.
Yeah, you have an excellent point there, Lindsay. I guess there's a couple of reasons to be concerned here. On the micro level, being chipped with something, how do we know what that's going to do to us long term? Where are there long-term studies? As far as I'm aware, there aren't any. If you can put a chip in someone for 50 years and have a big study with a big sample size and a control group, a proper scientific study, and then in 50 years we find that being chipped doesn't lead to higher rates of cancer or other problems, sure, maybe then we can consider it on the micro level. But as it stands right now, you're taking a massive risk putting this kind of stuff into you without any of those studies to prove that it's okay over the long term of a life. Then you've got the macro concerns like who is using this data, what are they using the data for, how long until our money goes onto these chips, and then once our money is on these chips, how easy is it for them just to shut us down if they don't like us talking about, for instance, a royal commission into child sex abuse? Ethan, what say you?
I think a lot of good points have been made. There obviously is a lot of concerns for this, and it's not just on all the levels that have been touched. My fear is that just a digitalization, got it out there, of human beings. You know what I mean? And the fact is that you don't know what's in these microchips. You don't know who's developing them. You don't know what the motives are behind it. And it goes back to speaking about eugenics. You know, who knows that those chips have been tested safely for cancer? Who knows that they couldn't just release a toxin in your body when a switch is given? You know what I mean? When the call is given, it's just unbelievable. And to masquerade it behind this ideal that it's going to improve our lifestyles because we're going to be more safe and secure, we're going to be able to easier access our personal data, our details and whatnot. It's just madness. It's absolute madness. And the problem is that the mainstream media and the government establishment are pushing this as a good thing. And as long as they control the minds of the majority of the masses through the television and through these news websites, people are just going to go along with it. And it's a scary thing to think, because once they get past this step of normalizing it as acceptable, what's next? And you need to think about that, because now over in the United States, they're talking about jailing anti-vaccination parents, trying to make it mandatory, trying to draw a line between how the state is better for you and they know better ideals. So who's not to say that can't come to the chips as well, Johnno?
Well, Ethan, let's think about it though. What if they give you 10 free apps with your new Apple iChip? Would you consider it then?
Is one of them an Australian Roundtable app to listen to? Or?
What about you, Zac? I'll give you the final word on this one before we press on. What do you think about all of what we discussed?
Well, I think the RFID chip is probably going to be used in the future as a means of control, but initially I think it will be used as a means of technology, the next level of, the smartphones and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's kind of a scary proposition to have something implanted in your body. You have no idea what it's made of, but more importantly, people will be able to track where you are, where you've been, how many phone calls you've made with it, or whatever it does, and if you have money in it or passwords, who controls that. It's a very scary proposition.
Yeah, I said I'd give you the final word just so that you'd say something, but I've got more to say on this topic. I'll read out a few comments from the live chat. Robert Alexander says that he thinks insurance companies will demand businesses have employees chipped for security reasons. That's possible. The way that I see this going down would be, just suppose, hypothetically, there's a school abduction where there are these bad kiddie abductors going around, and it turns out that if only we knew where the kids were, we could have saved them. They were alive for 2 days. If only we knew where they were. And next thing, they've got vans going out to schools for voluntary chip implants. You imagine if the mouth-breathing masses out in the suburbs are told, not just the suburbs, I shouldn't say that, just the people of Australia, the masses are told, well, we're going to be giving out voluntary chip implants, and look what all these good parents are doing. Then they show a montage of 3 or 4 parents going, oh, I had to get little Johnny chipped. He didn't like it at first, but he's okay now. They would swallow this nonsense up just like that, and that's actually how I think it might go down.
I completely agree.
They'll stage a nonsense school abduction or something like this, get it put in the kids who are young, because people like Lindsay, good luck chipping Lindsay. You come to Lindsay's house and try and chip him, it's not going to end well for either of you. The same even goes for people our age, in our late teens, 20s, 30s, whatever. Some of us are wise to this, but the kids, what say do they get in it? You know what I mean? They've got no say. So chip them when they're young, they get used to it. They don't know any different. Lindsay, what say you?
Yeah. When you talk about that, we were the same with injections. You'd roll up to the school, you'd have a letter from your parents saying, no, he's not going to get an injection. The nurse would roll it up, throw it in the bin, and jab the needle into you anyway. And then later on we find out, oh, it's got monkey virus in it or something that passes on to, to your kids and their kids. And, so my thing is, don't trust these people at all, no matter what they say. That's my take on everything they do.
Boy, Ethan, Robert Alexander has a better offer. If 10 apps isn't good enough for you, what if they chuck in 100 flybys points?
5 cents.
Sounds good. I learnt what flybys were last week, so it's a good offer.
We're all learning a lot of things. So hey, thanks to everyone in the live chat. We're up to roughly 50 live viewers, which is fantastic. We do need to press on, but since this was your topic, boys, I'll throw over to you both for one final comment. Lindsay, any final thoughts on this topic?
No, I've said everything I want to say. Thanks.
And you, Ethan?
I just want to reiterate what Lindsay said. Just don't trust the establishment and stay vigilant. That's my final thoughts.
And look who's come to life. It looks as though Zac has a thought to add. Please, Zac, grace us with your voice.
Yeah, well, it's a good point you made there, Lindsay, about the vaccines being kind of socially unacceptable in your time, and now they're being forced on us. Like when I was last on in episode 14, we talked about vaccines becoming mandatory. So if it's taken one generation for vaccines to become from socially acceptable to mandatory, it'll probably take about the same time or less for RFID chipping to become from socially acceptable to mandatory.
Look, I do want to press on because time is of the essence, but I do just want to ask you, Zac, just a hypothetical question. They come to your house, just say it does go the way of trying to do this and force you to do it. They come to your house and say, we're putting a chip in you. What do you do?
It's hard to know what you do, exactly. That's a good point.
I like to think that there are a lot of people out there who, okay, they'll cop this, they'll cop that, they'll cop you stealing their money from you through increased taxes and bank bail-ins and all of this. They'll cop longer hours at work. They'll cop the fact that houses now cost so much you need 2 incomes to afford the house. They'll cop all of these things, but if you decide to get physical and try and force them to take a chip into their body, that's when they say enough is enough. Now we're getting serious. I like to think that if it ever came to that point, that people would rise up against it, but we won't know until we're in that situation. And let's hope that by spreading the word about these things in advance, we can avoid it ever getting that far. We do have to move on to the next topic now, though, boys, because time is running out. And the next topic on the rundown is finance and something to do with money. So, Lindsay, do you want to take that one away for us?
Yeah, I will do. First of all, before I start on, I'd like to say that some of these things were written a couple of weeks ago, so I think they'll be fairly accurate still, but just bear that in mind when you hear it. Yeah, 3 weeks ago, you spoke on this podcast of the Swiss central bank's minimum exchange rate discount or disconnect from the euro and the surprise it caused on world markets. This last fortnight, I think it was, Canada announced without warning that it was reducing interest rates, and then this week Australia reduced its interest rates. Mike Larson from the Weiss Ratings Group claimed that Bloomberg said the Singaporean central bank was going to loosen money policy because of low inflation. And he quote, but Singapore is far from alone. Countries around the world are using their currencies in what I like to call a global money war. 9 countries eased policy in January alone, from India to Denmark to Canada, New Zealand, and they all piled on late Wednesday with a fresh round of verbal intervention. The stated or unstated goal is to weaken the currencies and gain an economic edge. It's not just those smaller central banks either. 2 of the biggest banks on the planet have been fighting this fight for several months now. The Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank don't even try to hide it. They want to cheapen the yen and the euro to boost exports and boost inflation. Consequences of and a history of cooperation with the US Federal Reserve can be damned. And I've got a link to that thing. And then in another quote from the same Mike on the 28th of February, he was talking about the Fed meeting that just took place then. So what did the Fed do and say at the first meeting of 2015? And so what's my take? I believe the Fed is embroiled in an increasingly violent global money war with foreign central banks and investors. It wants to move short-term rates off zero, but its compatriots overseas are taking increasingly diverse policy paths, complicating the issue. Now, this is my statement. Now, I'll finish the quote from him. It appears to me that the countries of the world are jostling for position in a looming trade war, not unlike those of the Great Depression. Until now, the Fed has been jollying the nations along not to break ranks, so they claim that if we do, we'll all be doomed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, the Russians' trade sanctions and the oil price collapse is leading to these other breakdowns. Nobody seems to know just where it will finish. Now, this quote is from Ainsley Bullion in Brisbane. They're a bullion dealer in Brisbane in Queensland. And it was the week before last. Gold and silver are now up 10.1% and 17.2% in US dollar spot terms, and an even better 12.3% and 19.6% in Aussie dollars for the year. To add to the situation, at the time when the silver is making substantial price gains, there has been almost 1,000 tonne of real metal removed from the ETF, and then he's got in brackets exchange traded funds, SLV, since December. So a fund that supposedly holds metal in accordance with prices is seeing their inventory reduce on a rising market. Now, I find that interesting because a lot of people keep telling me, oh, no, don't buy silver, put it in SLV. Okay, may I add that as of yesterday, the price of gold and silver had fallen to $1,233 US and $16.70 US. So even though the previous quote by the bullion company was when the price is up, it's just suddenly fallen in the last day or two. Now, this is a quote from the Inflation Association in the US from 2 weeks ago, and I found this really interesting. Quote, the European Central Bank just announced a few minutes ago that beginning in March, it will purchase 60 billion euros per month worth of sovereign bonds of Eurozone nations, with the purchases continuing for a period of 19 consecutive months through September 2016. The total value of the ECB's initial QE, quote, bond buying program will be 1.14 trillion euros or 1.31 trillion US dollars. Altogether, the ECB's balance sheet will expand by a total of 52.8%. The ECB's balance sheet will surpass its previous record high, reached in June 2012, of 3.1 trillion. For the last 9 years straight, gold has followed the ECB's balance sheet extremely closely. In early 2006, when the ECB's balance sheet was only worth 1.08 trillion, gold was just $613 per ounce. But as the ECB expanded its balance sheet by 187% to a peak monthly average of 3.1 trillion, gold prices also soared by 187% to a peak monthly average of $1.763 per ounce. Both the ECB's balance sheet and gold began their pullbacks at exactly the same time, dipped the exact same percentage from their highs, bottomed together, and are now rapidly rising together. Now, I'd never ever heard that before about that connection between those two things, and I found that really quite interesting. My comment on all this is that perhaps we can look to the aftermath of the Great Depression for answers to where we're going now. And the horrible thing I have to say is, Third World War, anyone? Okay, that's it.
Okay, well, that's a good way to end your segment there, Lindsay, to ask a hypothetical. But I'm going to put it back on you now. Taking together all of what you just told us and the information that you've gathered for your segment, where do you see this going, honestly?
I think it's just going to get worse. I think all the countries find it very easy to reduce their interest rates or whatever so that they have a competitive advantage. And this is what happened in the Great Depression, and it caused trade wars. Now, trade wars inevitably lead to hot wars, and we've seen that time and time again. And I don't think there's any way out of this, to be honest with you. Now, admittedly, we've been having almost constant wars since the Second World War, in Vietnam and Afghanistan and whatever. But I think you'll find that we'll get involved. Well, you can see the way the US has gone into the Ukraine, and it's almost like a proxy war. The Ukraine-Russian war is almost like a proxy war between US and Russia. And already Russia's bringing its group in together. You've got the BRICS, China and anyway, South Africa and India and etc. Now, I can see the world dividing down the middle again. It's almost like the Axis and the Allies and etc. etc. And I think the people who run the world know what they're doing, and I think that's what they're lining us up for. Okay, over to you.
Back perhaps 2 months ago, I forget which episode it was, I had Zac A on the show. It was just me and him for the show. Neither Lindsay nor Ethan could make of that episode. And we spend a lot of time talking about Russia and where they fit in this great picture, because there's basically two camps of people out there. There are the people who think that Russia is a genuine alternative to the prevailing paradigm, and that the Russians are going to save us from the New World Order, and that what's happening in Ukraine is evidence of the fact that they're trying to surround Putin and destroy him. Then there's the other camp that say, well, hold on a second, look at his connections to a whole bunch of people, like they've been discussing in our live chat earlier in the show. Look at the fact that he still has money that's controlled by the BIS. Look at the fact that he hasn't really come out and said the truth about anything to do with 9/11 or other events that would be easy to sink the US government. And they say, really, he's just part of the whole grand scheme, and it's a classic old false left-right paradigm that they use in federal politics, except that this time, instead of domestic politics, it's international politics. And if you want to throw your lot in with Putin and believe that he's your savior, go for it. They want that. They don't care. So long as you think that the next war that's coming is a real one, you're likely to give your taxes, give your life in war, what have you. And on that little note, Ethan, I'll throw to you, mate. What are your thoughts?
A couple of points. I think Lindsay hit the nail on the head talking about the echoing similarities to the Great Depression, and that the way that I look at it, having studied the causes of World War I and World War II, trade had a lot to do with the tensions beforehand and the increased by design the pathway that led to the war. Personally, it's hard to see where this is going. I always believe that a third world war is in their agenda, but then, as you said, Johnno, there's a bigger picture that you need to look at. Either way, whether you believe that Russia is one of the crusaders against the New World Order, or whether they're a part of the New World Order and this is just another funded war from both sides, I think that either way it's going to be a war against the people, and that's what the true war is going to be. It's going to be a war against the people. It's going to be war. It's a war already between the people and the establishment, because we're trying to prevent all of this from happening. We're trying to prevent the New World Order grid from taking its place here, and little things like this are incrementally continuing towards that, and I think it needs to be stopped in its tracks, Johnno.
Yeah, and in the live chat, Biz1 4Life, who seems like a new listener, so good to have you on board, says that recently Australia signed a free trade agreement with China behind the United States back, and he makes a good point about that free trade agreement, which almost nobody in this country knows anything about. I did discuss this just shortly after G20, which is when the deal was signed. In fact, I think G20 ran in the middle of November last year on the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and the deal was signed on the Monday. And we had front page spreads of Barack Obama, this great guy giving what looked like a Sieg Heil sign. That was all over the front page of our newspapers. But very few people know anything about that the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And I did discuss the fact that that free trade agreement just makes it easier for Chinese corporations to buy out Australian land, both agricultural and residential. And I don't know if Biz14Life was making the point that he thinks Australia is siding with China over the US. I don't see it that way. I just see it as Australia selling out more of its national sovereignty, which is what the New World Order is all about. If the nations have less power, then the people who are really in control have more power. Simple as that. Lindsay, what say you?
Yeah, I agree. I'm in no illusion that the major banks and Israel, for that matter, have a lot of say in what goes on in China. I don't have any doubts that they control a certain amount of where China goes. And people think China's like an all-powerful, but I don't think they are all-powerful. I think they're under a certain control as well. And just like you're saying, I've no doubt that Putin is under a certain amount of control as well. That's just the way the world works. We don't know who exactly controls everything. People talk about Rothschild. I'm not even convinced that Rothschild's the head. We don't know where the head of the snake is. But I'm in no illusions at all about who controls what, and I don't think any of these people are really in control. Over you.
Lindsay, I want to just question you further on that. You don't think that there is a group of people, whoever they are, whether they're Rothschilds or the Freemasons or a certain religious ethnic group or whoever, you don't think there's anyone at the top who are planning all of this explicitly?
Oh, no, I didn't say that. I think there is somebody at the top, but I don't know who they are. Like, people talk about the Rothschilds being in charge, but I'm not convinced that they're the ones who are in charge. There well could be somebody above them. And like, if you were in charge of this, would you let the people know your name? No. I would think that, the Rothschilds are just dogs' bodies like the rest of them, all the way down you know, there'll be somebody there who moves around the world and nobody even knows who they are. That's my view of it.
Lindsay, how many, say there's 24 million people in Australia, roughly what percentage of them do you think know the name Rothschild, and what percentage of those people know anything about the Rothschilds' documented history to do with banking and finance?
It's very difficult for me to say because I move in circles where, you know, nearly everybody knows this stuff. So, you know, it's probably not, it's probably unrepresentative to ask me that.
Fair enough. I'll throw that one to Ethan. And Ethan won't answer, so I'll throw.
No, hold on. I'm here. I'm here. There's a lot happening in the background here, so I put my mic on mute so you don't hear it, but my computer's running so slow that by the time I switch the tab to get back, it's either. Anyway, I think Lindsay hit the nail right on the head in terms of I do think that it goes beyond that. I do think that if there was a group of people controlling the planet, the cloud is so mysterious that I do believe it goes further beyond that it does in terms of knowing who's really controlling this. I do believe there's something that's there that's controlling this, that's manipulating human destiny, if you want to call it that, free humanity, whatever you want to call it. I do believe there is a group there doing it, but you ask people, who are the ultimate controllers of this? And you get 10 different answers. Oh, it's the Vaticans, it's the Rothschilds, it's the Zionists, it's, you know, there's 10 different answers that people can get. And I don't believe that either argument can hold much merit because I do think there's a level beyond that are keeping these factions from, one, not taking over each other, and two, working cohesively through the pyramid scheme to take us over.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And that's why I say to people, even if we don't know legitimately who is at the top, or even if there is a top, even if we don't know that, we can know when certain groups or people do have a lot of power and when they abuse that power. And so that's why I generally focus my efforts on who are the people highest up in the chain that we can identify and can prove have been abusing that power, and focus on trying to expose them and spread information about them. And so whilst I do find these questions of who's at the top or is there a top fascinating, I try to never lose sight of the fact that we do know there are certain groups, whether it's the Bilderbergs or the Trilaterals or the certain nations in the Six Eyes or what have you, we do know there are certain groups who are doing dastardly things. We can prove that, and I try to never lose sight of the fact that even if they're not at the very top, they've got enough power that they should be using that fairly for all people, and if they're not, they should be exposed. But I tell you what, guys, if you're happy, we're going to move on. Actually, this is your topic, Lindsay, so I'll give you the final thought, and then we'll move on.
No, I've said all I want to say, thanks.
And you know who's been very quiet, far too quiet for a guest over here, is my mate, Zac. Zac, any thoughts on what we've discussed?
Well, I kind of slightly disagree with the other two because I think it probably is the Rothschild family, the banking family that has existed for several hundred years, and that's just with the name Rothschild, which was established when the first Rothschild changed his name to Red Shield in German. I would probably say that is the top of the ladder, but I don't know explicitly. So
yeah, and I'm pretty open-minded to that possibility because we know from Cecil Rhodes's wills that the Rothschilds were involved in that, and Cecil Rhodes said that he was leaving his money, including the money that goes to Rhodes Scholars at Oxford, to keep the British Empire as the preeminent force on the planet. Now you might say, well, doesn't that mean that it's the British Empire that's at the top? Yeah, well, who controls the British Empire? And if you look into that, there is a lot of evidence that points to a certain family, and so I'm open-minded to that possibility. But we do have to move on, so we'll move on to the final topic of today before we get to the final thoughts, and that's just a quick one to do with the TransAsia air crash, and I'm sure plenty of people in the live chat are looking forward to us discussing this. Before I go any further, just quickly, I'll throw to you, Lindsay. Do you know anything about this TransAsia crash in Taiwan a few days ago?
No, I saw it on the television. You know, they had a spectacular picture of the plane going in sideways, but other than that, I know very little.
Well, I won't throw to you during the rest of this segment then. And Ethan, have you been following any of this TransAsia Taiwanese air crash?
Yeah, the incident itself I have, but I haven't had time to research into some of the mixed opinions that have been happening between it. I watched a couple of videos to do some background research this morning, and I couldn't really gather much context from them all, but I am familiar with the crash in general, so I'm interested to hear what is going on currently.
Okay, well, I haven't actually prepared a good background for the event, so I can't even tell you exactly what day it was. I think it might have been the Tuesday, might have been the Wednesday, I'm not too sure. But the point I wanted to make today was just to quickly touch on some of the disagreements that I see taking place between different members of what I call the event skeptic community. And I know that a lot of people call us a conspiracy theory community or something like this, and that's fine. I call it event skepticism. When there is an event, you look at it and weigh up, do you think the event is legitimate? Because we know we've been lied to about so many events. And so with this plane crash, the basic details for anyone who's not familiar is that, like I said, during the week, a turboprop plane in Taiwan crashed shortly after takeoff, supposedly into a river. Something like 60 or 70 people were on board. The majority of them died. There were some survivors who were rescued, and it's been leading news, certainly on CNN, which is oftentimes a big giveaway that not all is what's being presented. Now, on the Wednesday We'll Do It Live, which is Thursday night for us, they discussed this, on the show at the time. And in the days since, a number of people who are, I guess, high up in the event skeptic community, at least on YouTube, have been releasing videos about it and disagreeing over whether or not the event was legitimate. I just want to go through a bunch of reasons why I think those who think this event might have been staged have every right to feel that way, whether or not they're right. I'm going to go through a few basic dot points that I've got in front of me. Firstly, why was there no footage, at least that I've seen, immediately after the crash? It happened in a highly urbanized area. You would think that immediately after a plane went into a river, that there would be people getting out their cameras, their iPhones, whatever, and immediately filming it. You would think that. Now, there might be that footage existing on the internet. I haven't seen it yet. And if it doesn't exist, I would want to know, why is there no footage immediately after the crash? I also want to know, where's the fuel? I mean, this plane crashed immediately after takeoff, so it should have been full of fuel. How come I haven't seen any photos of fuel slicks all over the area, around the river? Why do we see none of that? Again, this evidence might exist. If it does, fair enough. Then there's the taxi. The taxi that was illegitimate, because for those who aren't aware, it kind of fell into a river right near a freeway, and one of its wings supposedly hit a taxi that was driving on the freeway before falling into the river. If you look at the taxi and the damage that was done to the front of it, how come one of the supporting panels for the window is still sitting there on the right-hand side, when you would think that would be the one part of the car that would be most damaged by a plane wing coming in at that angle? This is not, I mean, the taxi isn't in and of itself proof, but it's a question that I asked when I saw the taxi. Then when you look at the crash in the river, where are the wings? I mean, where are the wings? We see the rear part of the fuselage, but where are the wings? You don't see it either in the river, and again, this is all just based on the photos and videos I've seen. This stuff might exist, and if it does, fantastic. I'm just basing this on what I found with a relatively quick search before the show. Where are the wings, and where is the front part of the fuselage? It might exist, fair enough if it does. The survivor, if you look at the footage of the survivors, there's about a dozen of them sitting there, standing there. And the first question is, what are they standing on? Some people say sandbars, some people say other parts of the wreckage. You notice that they look relatively emotionless. Now, you might say, well, they're all in shock or whatever, and that could well be the case, but it was something that I noticed, that not one of them was breaking down in tears or in any way hysterical, despite the fact that they just survived a plane crash and probably seen people die. I mean, think about it, just seen people die, and none of them were pulling out bodies or anything. I don't know, I just found their whole reaction to be a little bit suspect. Honestly, I did. The lack of the debris between the bridge and the river. I mean, I just saw a short clip of someone looking over the bridge into the river, and you don't see any, as far as I could see, any footage of debris between the river and the bridge. And you'd think that if it clipped the side of the bridge, there'd be at least some debris between the river and the bridge, but I didn't see any. The plane was, or the rear part of the fuselage was just stuck in the river. And then you've got all of the boats that were in the water. Allegedly the rescue boats. What were they doing, and where did they get all of these rescue boats from? There's just like a dozen boats just, cruising around the plane, apparently not doing anything. Now, you could explain that. It could just be that they didn't have a good chain of command and someone didn't give good orders. He just said, go and get out there and do something, and these people didn't. I mean, you can kind of explain it, but I did also find that odd. And also the idea that no one attempted to swim. I mean, you wouldn't think that the boats were there waiting for the plane. So there would have been a period where the survivors were there on the plane not knowing that rescue was coming. You'd think that some of them might have attempted to swim. They might not have. Again, you can explain this away, but that's just one of the many dot points that I noticed when I was looking at the footage that made me question, is this event legitimate? And none of this evidence, I think, proves that the thing was fake. Of course, the main thing that most people looked at was the video. If you look at the 3 or 4 clips that were originally released from different dash cams, there is something very odd about the footage, and a lot of people noticed that at start. Even people who have since said they think the event's legitimate, a lot of people said it just does look weird. It doesn't look natural. And that was the first thing that made me question the event. Now, you might say, well, what does a natural plane crash, tilted at 90 degrees, pitched at 90 degrees, crash into a river, what does that look like from a dash cam? Obviously, we don't know. We've got nothing to compare it to. But something about it did just seem off. And so when you add all of these dot points up, I thought to myself, well, this very well could be a staged event. So you have to ask the obvious question, cui bono, who benefits? Who would benefit from staging this? We know who benefits from Sandy Hook, people trying to take away America's gun rights, right? We know who benefits from the Boston bombings, among other things. They can just declare martial law in a city and drive tanks down streets. 9/11, we know who benefits from that. Many people think that it was, the US government wanting to go to war or oil contracts, and that was all part of it. Of course, if you look deep enough, you'll see there are other people who benefited from the 9/11 attacks and the wars that followed that. But the point is, we know who benefits from that. Who benefits from staging a plane hoax? Who benefits from that? That's a good question, and I don't claim to have the answers, but these are the kind of questions that I think people should be allowed to ask. If not within this community, where can you ask these questions? And one place that I might look at for people who benefit from this would be the people at the top who have a big staged event in the planning. If they can get away with a pretty dodgy looking video and a whole bunch of points that I've just read out, and they can get away with that, and even the skeptics community are willing to accept it, then maybe they know they don't have to try too hard for their next 9/11. That's one potential answer. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but that's one place I might look at for cui bono. If an event like this can split the community, then they're onto a winner, aren't they? Which leads me to my next point, which is this. I haven't been following any of the drama that seems to be taking place online today or yesterday. I've been too busy with my own channel and with preparing for today's show, so I don't know who has said this or who said that or what videos have said that, but I did see a few videos that seemed like they were a little bit aggressive towards other members of the community, and that's understandable. If you put a lot of time into this and you feel as though the community is just starting to build, and then you genuinely feel that an event that you think is 100% real, that other members are saying fake, you think that makes us all look bad, you can see why you might take that personally and react in a way that isn't ideal. I do understand that, even if I don't support it. And then on the other side, you've got people who say, well, this is clearly a hoax. How come you can't see this? Of course, we know there are so many fake alternative media people out there, like your Alex Joneses and so forth, that as soon as someone who we trust says that they're 100% convinced something is real, it's natural that some people are going to say, well, this makes me question you overall. I wouldn't agree with those people then calling these people out as shills or whatever, but you can understand why they might be taken aback if they're 100% convinced the thing was a hoax. So to anybody who's 100% convinced it was a hoax or 100% convinced it was fake, that's fair enough, but I don't think there's ever any real good reason to attack other members of the community for expressing their own views, which gets to, I guess, my final point, which is this. If we can't express skepticism in the event skepticism community, then you can't express it anywhere. So I'm not saying I think the event was a hoax, but I can see a whole bunch of reasons why I can see why other people might. I'm not saying the event was real, but if other people believe it was real, that's their right. I'm not putting out videos saying one thing or the other. I'm too busy with my Sydney Siege videos, but the point I want to make is the TransAsia plane crash, was it real, was it fake? I think it is an important question, and we should be able to ask that question here without attacking each other and without taking it personally when people disagree with us. Now, I know that you guys aren't completely au fait with the incident itself, but based on this general idea that we're in a community where people do ask questions of events, even events that are taboo to ask questions about, what do you think about this notion that where we disagree, we should be able to still say, well, I agree with you on so many other things, even if we disagree on this, I still love you as a brother in this movement of spreading the truth. Lindsay, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and that's always been my idea. Even not in this group or this way of thinking, just in general, I'd like to let everybody have their say. I think that's the mark of a liberal society where everybody has their say, and you make up your own mind from the evidence before you. And then you've also got the right to change as you are presented with new evidence. You can change your mind, and you shouldn't be taking a task over that either.
Very
okay,
well said. Sorry, Ethan, you're up next, mate.
I think you made some fantastic points, Jono, and we've spoken on this previously off air, just speaking about the movement in general. And the problem is although we can sit back and say that it's a simple thing, a lot of other people in this movement don't see it that way. They think that if one person has a different perception of things to them on one field as opposed to looking at the majority of fields they do agree on, they attack them, they call them shills, they want to demonize them. And that's what I've seen a lot through my personal experiences. But at the end of the day, you're right, we should just be able to coexist. And that's the beauty of podcasts like this roundtable. We can all come with our own personal opinions. Zac mentioned before that he has a different perception, that he does believe that the Rothschilds are the end of it, or the end of the tip of the snake head, if you want to put it in those words. And he has every right to express a different perception for us, because that's the beauty of a liberal democracy, a true proper democracy where we can state our opinions. And I think it's healthy for the scene to do that. It's healthy for people to disagree, and it's healthy for people to build together and continue on regardless of whether they see differently, because at the end of the day, we all have the same enemy, and saying things amongst ourselves isn't going to help us at all. So that's what I think. And at the end of the day, as an individual, stick to your own self, stick to your own beliefs, and make your own conclusions no matter what anyone else thinks.
Very well said. We have to be able to disagree. I mean, Zac's sitting across from me here in my room, a good friend of mine already. We haven't actually known each other that long, but I consider the guy a good friend. We disagree on a lot of things, and one particular thing, I'm not going to name what the movement is, but there's a movement that he believes in passionately, which I happen to think is at best misguided, and at worst 100% controlled opposition. But you know what? I still go to events that he hosts regarding that thing. I still talk to the people there. I still love anyone who's searching for the truth, even if I think they're misguided, just as I would hope that someone would still love me, even if I was misguided. And that's the whole point. I'm sitting across from a guy, smiling, having a good time, with a guy who is part of a movement that I don't like, and vice versa. And what's the problem? And on that note, Zac, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, well, just to go into that point, I kind of do disagree with you, Jono. I think, it just looked like when I looked on the news bulletins and everything about the plane crashing and the circumstances surrounding it, it didn't seem there were no red flags to me that I would normally pick up on with these kind of events, 9/11 or whatever, where they were doing some sort of security drill about the exact situation that happened or something like that. There was nothing like that kind of led me to believe that it was anything more than just an accident or accidental plane crash.
Yeah, you're a shill. No, I'm only kidding. That's the point I'm making. We've got different views.
Yeah, we disagree.
Yeah,
no big deal.
And look, I know it is tough. You look at the people, and I don't really want to name any names here, but everyone knows what I'm talking about. Some of these people have put in so much time into this movement and so much effort to help wake people up, including waking me up. we all know it's a long process. You don't watch one video and then suddenly you're awake. There's so much learning to do, so many rabbit holes to go down, and some of the people who have different opinions on this TransAsia crash, they're people who, in their own way, have helped me to be who I am today, and I love them for it. And when you look at the amount of time that they've put in and the people that they've influenced, they have every right to take it personally if someone attacks them or accuses them or whatever. I guess I always try and look at things through other people's eyes. If you've put that much time into a movement and you think someone's trying to do it wrong, you can see why you might get upset about it. Doesn't justify being aggressive about it, but you can see it from their perspective. Similarly, if you think, like, put the shoe on the other foot. Similarly, if someone who's put a lot of time into it thinks that someone isn't seeing the forest for the trees, you can understand why they might get frustrated. So I've got no issue with anyone who has been involved in the last couple of days of drama. I still love them all, and I'm sure that in a few days' time it'll all be patched up, and that'll be the end of that. But guys, we've got the 2 hours, and we still haven't given our final thoughts. So we'll leave. Are you guys happy to leave that topic there?
Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. Well, what we're going to do is I'm going to throw around the room to get our final thoughts. We'll start with the silent man, the ghost. Zac, what are your final thoughts on today's show, mate?
Well, I like the final point you made about everyone being allowed to say what they want to say. I think that's really, really important in a free society. And I certainly do not agree with everyone by any means. If I only hung out with people that I agreed 100% with, I'd be all by myself. So I do not disagree with everyone about everything, but I still respect people for what they do, and I definitely respect Jono for what he does, even though I don't agree with him about everything he says, obviously.
That's a good thing to say, that if I only hung out with people I agreed with, I'd only hang out with myself. For me, it's even worse. If I only hung out with people I'd agree with, I wouldn't even hang out with myself.
Yeah.
I'll throw to you over there, Lindsay, final thoughts for episode... Oh, by the way, before we go any further, there is going to be a Q&A after the show, just like there always is for live listeners. This is just our final thoughts for the official upload. Lindsay, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, I haven't really got any final thoughts. I think I've said everything I want to say all the way through. I think it's been a good show, so I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Fantastic. And over to my mate down there, halfway to Logan. Ethan, final thoughts, mate?
I just think, just reiterating that even though we do have our differences in the scene, most of us, at the end of the day, the community is still growing, and I thank everyone for tuning in and supporting the website, and now going to be supporting your videos that you're going to be making, Johnno. And it's just still amazing how the community is growing and building every day, and I thank everyone that supports it, everyone that's a part of it, and 2015 is already shaping up to be a great year for us, and we're going to continue strong.
Oh, it took you 2 hours, but that was a beautiful segue there, Ethan. Yes, my channel. Well, that leads me to my final thoughts. I've got a few of them. Firstly, yeah, you're right. I have finally got my own channel up and running. It's taken me a lot longer than it should, but for those who aren't aware, Truth is Free Media is going to be the name of my platform from this point on. I've registered the domain truthisfreemedia.com. I've got the YouTube channel Truth is Free Media and the Zeekly, and I have uploaded my first video, which I've entitled Sunrise Sneak Preview. It's about 15 minutes. And my hope is that as many of our Australian listeners, especially, as possible can watch it before tonight, because, of course, tonight there are two specials, Channel 7 and Channel 9. Two of our three commercial broadcasters in this country are running specials on the Sydney Siege. And I've got a request to make to all our Aussie listeners. Please, if you can, record at least one of those shows to your hard drive. I'm going to try and record both, but I'm not sure if my TV is going to be able to record both of them, so I might have to just record the one. Obviously, if I am going to record one, it'll be Channel 7, because they're the people I've exposed as fraudsters. And if you haven't already seen my video, go and watch Sunrise Sneak Preview. There's no debating the evidence. They lied to us through their teeth. You can bet they're going to do it again tonight. So please record those shows and upload the sections you disagree with, or just upload as much as you can, just in case I can't get my hands on it. You're helping out the community, so please record. Channel 7, I think, in Brisbane at least, from 6:30, they're both running simultaneously, and my point is, please record as much as you can of these fraudsters, because that's what they are, fraudsters. So Truth is Free Media, check that out. Please subscribe to the channel. I want to try and get that as big as I can. And I've got some big news. I don't want to say too much, but I understand that by this time next week, Lindsay, there will be a Silver Fox News, and I, for one, can't wait for that. So as soon as that happens, we will upload a promo to our channel at Australian Roundtable. Finally, the emails. We have received a number of emails from people, and I want to say a huge thanks to everyone. A few people have given us some hot tips that I'm still looking into, and I can assure you, if you're waiting for me to talk about what you've emailed through to us, I will. I just have to double check and triple check a few things, because some of what we've been emailed about, Zac, is fascinating stuff. I just don't want to go to air until I've really double checked it. So please keep the emails coming. If I haven't read out your email yet, or I haven't talked about it yet, it's not because we don't read them. We certainly do. We thank you all for sending that kind of stuff through. And if you do send through a hot tip through the email, and again, the email address is available at AusroundTable.com, just make sure you say whether or not you want us to use your name. If you want us to use your name or whatever, that's cool, we will. If you want to remain anonymous, we'll just say, hey, an anonymous listener emailed us through this information, and yeah, just be clear about what you want us to do. And also, even if you don't have a hot tip, but you can't listen to the show live, and you kind of feel like you're missing out because we read out the live chat listeners' comments during the show, we've got, from as of next week, I haven't double checked this with Ethan yet because he didn't turn up to the studio today, but my plan is that as of next week, we're going to have a little section before our final thoughts where we read out email comments. So if you want to send through an email just with questions or comments about the show or about what's happening in the world, send them through, and we'll try and read out one or two on the Australian Roundtable mailbag. But that's the final thoughts from me. We're going to wrap up the show. This has been, again, live listeners, just stay tuned. We'll go to our Q&A like we always do, but this has been the episode 18 of the Australian Roundtable podcast. I thank everyone for listening, and we'll catch you next week, 3 p.m. Brisbane time.
Thank you.